nongeye kubasuhuza nitwa Muhire Louis Antoine abandi buze kuba umwe mu ba MC banyu hamwe na mugenzi wanjye
Diana Gitera.
Twagira ngo tubanyuremo vuba mu ncamake gahunda dufite mu kanya abashyitsi bahire bari buze kudufasha kubakira kandi tubakirane ibyishimo byinshi kuko harabavuye kure. Hakaza gukurikiraho panel ebyiri ubwo nabyita ibiganiro bibiri. Kimwe gifite teme mu cyongereza ya Driving National Transformation and Realizing Africa's Full Potential. Iki cya kabiri ni Passing on the Spirit of Liberation to a New African Generation. Ni ibiganiro bibiri ariko bitari bitoya tubuze kwigiramo byinshi cyane. Kimwe kiraza muri mbere ya afamidi bivuze mu Gifaransa, ikindi ni muri afternoon. Hagati aho abashaka côté logistique amatoilette ni musohoka ni left and right iburyo bumoso. Abakeneye gufata ikawa hari on your right muvuye muri building hari Bourbon Coffee. Murakoze.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And to go a little bit over what Louis just mentioned in terms of how the day will unfold, we will start with an opening ceremony, as you all know. So we're just waiting for our high-level guests to come in. We will have two panels today. One will take place in the morning, and the theme of that panel is Driving National Transformation and Realizing Africa's Full Potential. And the second panel, which will take place after the lunch, will feature a lot of young people, as you will see, and it's called Passing on the Spirit of Liberation to a New African Generation. So we should be finishing the sessions today by the end of the afternoon, around 5 o'clock. And in between, it's also good for you to know that if you're looking for the restrooms, there are restrooms on both sides of the building. So going out, you can either go to the left or to the right, and you'll find it. And those of you that need a little bit of caffeine, if you need to have a coffee, you must have seen the Bourbon Coffee sign outside going to the right when exiting the building. We hope you have a really nice day. We're very excited about these conversations that are still continuing on the topic of helping Africa reach its full potential. And we wish you a very, very good day. Thank you.
Amahirwe nk'ayasaya bose umura abanyarwanda turabizi Paul Kagame turi kumwe nawe. Thank you Kagame, thank you Kagame, urashoboye. Thank you Kagame, thank you Kagame, urashoboye. Thank you Kagame, thank you Kagame, urashoboye. Paul Kagame turi kumwe nawe. Abanyarwanda ni twebwe tukuze, abandi bose bakumenye bukeye, bakuye u Rwanda mu icuraburindi, none ubu wabaye ubukombe. Imvugo niyo ngiro, ikirogoya n'umuziro. Imvugo yawe niyo ngiro, kirogoya n'umuziro. Uri Imana yaduhaye amahirwe nk'ayasaya bose umura abanyarwanda turabizi. Paul Kagame turi kumwe nawe. Thank you Kagame, thank you Kagame, urashoboye. Thank you Kagame, thank you Kagame, urashoboye. Thank you Kagame, thank you Kagame, urashoboye. Paul Kagame turi kumwe nawe. Warakoze, urashoboye, tuyobore, urashoboye. Wafashe u Rwanda uruha abanyarwanda, buri wese uba afite ijambo. Turajyana ntawe usigara ubumwe wadutoje tuzabukomeza imvugo ya niyo ngiro ikirogoya n'umuziro imvugo yawe niyo ngiro kirogoya n'umuziro uri Imana yaduhaye amahirwe n'ayasaye bose humura abanyarwanda turabizi Paul Kagame turi kumwe nawe thank you Kagame thank you Kagame urashoboye thank you Kagame thank you Kagame thank you Kagame thank you Kagame urashoboye Paul Kagame turi kumwe nawe thank you Kagame 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 urashoboye Paul Kagame turi kumwe nawe thank you Kagame 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 Paul Kagame turi kumwe nawe Kagame yanze kuganwa aharanira ubumwe bw'abanyarwanda burya umugabo nusohoza ubutumwa bwamutumye ntaniganywa ijambo ahorana umurava mu byakora byose nk'umwana w'u Rwanda aharanira ubumwe bw'abanyarwanda inyamibwa rutemba ubuzima mihigo y'igikakarubamba ku makuza ngiringo gasindinda ngira imbaraga simbashwe iserija ku rugamba n'indakumirwa aharanira ubumwe bw'abanyarwanda burya umugabo nusohoza ubutumwa bwamutumye ntaniganywa ijambo ahorana umurava mu byakora byose nk'umwana w'u Rwanda aharanira ubumwe bw'abanyarwanda kapiteni ku rugamba yaritanze aharanira ubumwe bw'abanyarwanda koroneri ku rugamba ntiyahatanze aharanira ubumwe bw'abanyarwanda burya umugabo nusohoza ubutumwa bwamutumye ntaniganywa ijambo ahorana umurava mu byakora byose nk'umwana w'u Rwanda aharanira ubumwe bw'abanyarwanda generali ku rugamba yaritanze aharanira ishema ry'abanyarwanda iyo mu mahanga mwaritanze muharanira ishema ry'abanyarwanda burya umugabo nusohoza ubutumwa bwamutumye ntaniganywa ijambo ahorana umurava mu byakora byose nk'umwana w'u Rwanda aharanira ubumwe bw'abanyarwanda burya umugabo nusohoza ubutumwa bwamutumye ntaniganywa ijambo ahorana umurava mu byakora byose ahorana umurava mu byakora byose nk'umwana w'u Rwanda aharanira ubumwe bw'abanyarwanda burya umugabo nusohoza ubutumwa bwamutumye ntaniganywa ijambo ahorana umurava mu byakora byose nk'umwana w'u Rwanda Bugesera. Karame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, wanamiye mucogeje. Karame Mungeri we, Kagame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, wanamiye mucogeje. Karame Mungeri we, nari naheze mu kigwa. Karame Mungeri we, nubatse mu manegeka. Karame Mungeri we, wankoreye ibikomeye. Karame Mungeri w'ubuntuye mu magorofa. Karame Mungeri we, Kagame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, wanamiye mucogeje. Karame Mungeri we, Kagame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, wanamiye mucogeje. Karame Mungeri we, ndifuza ko tugumana. Karame Mungeri we, mbabarira unyemerere. Karame Mungeri we, kugira ngo ntacikana. Karame Mungeri we, niba ibyiza ndi kubona. Karame Mungeri we, ndifuza kubihorana. Karame Mungeri we, Kagame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, wanamiye mucogeje. Karame Mungeri we, Kagame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, wanamiye mucogeje. Karame Mungeri we, Kagame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, Karame Mungeri we, wanamiye mucogeje. Karame Mungeri we.
Maendeleo na umoja.
Turacyari babandi bashobora kujya mu ndaki.
Wanda itajengwa na nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Kigali itajengwa na nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Yagatare na Gatsibo ni nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Kayonza na Kirehe ni nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Ngoma na Rwamagana ni nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Bugesera Musanze ni nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Kwetu Rusizi na Nyaruguru nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Wanda itajengwa na nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Kigali itajengwa na nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Isakara na Huye ni nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Nyanza na Muhanga ni nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Nyamagabe na Nyamasheke ni nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Rubavu na Karongi ni nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Male, Nyabihu na Ngororero ni nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. Ni sisi wenyewe. Wanda oye! Demokrasi, maendeleo na umoja.
Turacyari babandi bashobora kujya mu ndaki.
Wanda itajengwa na nani vijana? Wanda itajengwa na sisi wenyewe. wenyewe
sisi wenyewe
wanaitajengwa na nani vijana
wanaitajengwa na sisi wenyewe
Kigali itajengwa na nani vijana
wanaitajengwa na sisi wenyewe
ni sisi wenyewe
sisi wenyewe
ni sisi wenyewe
sisi wenyewe
Sakara na huye ni nani vijana
mwaramutse twongeye kubasuhuza turagira ngo mufate ibyicaro byanyu kuko gahunda igiye gutangira murakoze.
Just a gentle reminder to everyone that we take our seats. We should be starting very, very shortly. Thank you.
sisi wenyewe ni sisi wenyewe
sisi wenyewe
wanaitajengwa na nani vijana
wanaitajengwa na sisi wenyewe
Kigali itajengwa na nani vijana
wanaitajengwa na sisi wenyewe
ni sisi wenyewe
sisi wenyewe
ni sisi wenyewe
sisi wenyewe
Kamonyi Jichumvi ni nani vijana
wanaitajengwa na sisi wenyewe
na Rulindo ni nani vijana
wanaitajengwa na sisi wenyewe
Rutsiro na Burera ni nani vijana
wanaitajengwa na sisi wenyewe
Kwetu Chichi vijana
wanaitajengwa na sisi
Elelilo Nyaruchenje na Ruhango ni nani vijana Dandambara ya Nderugoba Onayo Dandambara ya Nderugoba Onayo Yarinze kakamizaninda Dandambara ya Nderugoba Yego Dandambara ya Nderugoba Onayo Dandambara ya Nderugoba Onayo Yarinze kakamizaninda Dandambara ya Nderugoba
Yego abo bamfite bwo gutora nawe ndutinye kumutora yarinze Kagame zaturinda ndandambara yadutera ubwoba
Dandambara ya Nderugoba Onayo Dandambara ya Nderugoba Onayo Yarinze kakamizaninda Dandambara ya Nderugoba Yego Dandambara ya Nderugoba Onayo Dandambara ya Nderugoba Onayo Yarinze kakamizaninda Dandambara ya Nderugoba Yego Kakinda tadukoreye Oya ndacho Niyo mpamvu tuzamutora Yarinze Kagame zaturinda Dandambara ya Nderugoba Yego Dandambara ya Nderugoba Dandambara ya Nderugoba Yego Dandambara Yarinze Kagame zandinda Dandambara ya Nderugoba Yego Dandambara
moshi we nawasenya amasoko twubatse nawavogera igihugu ndeba we ibidakwiriye nibibona nzabivuga kuko ibyo Kagame yatugejejeho n'ababisenya ndeba we n'ababisanya bukomeye Kagame mungeri we watubereye urugero
Maramutse.
Kagame mungeri we.
Hello, can we please rise up to welcome our high-level guest? Thank you. You may be seated, all of you.
Okay. Your Excellency, Mr. Benjamin Mkapa, former President of the Republic of Tanzania, Mrs. Mkapa, Honorable Vice Chairman of the RPF-Inkotanyi, Mr. Secretary General of the RPF-Inkotanyi, Your Excellency, First Lady of the Republic of Rwanda, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed, good morning. As our program is about to start, may we kindly request to rise up for the RPF anthem. Thank you. Thank you. You may be seated. Distinguished guests, good morning again, and welcome to this international conference under the theme of Liberation and Transformation, Realizing a Dignified and Prosperous Africa, organized in the framework of the 30th anniversary of the RPF-Inkotanyi. My name is Muhire Louis-Antoine, and I will be your MC today with
Diana Gitera.
And we would like to start this event with special words of appreciation to our guests, our brothers and sisters from Africa and our friends from all over the world who have joined us for this important conference by being physically present or by following us through social media. Welcome, bienvenue, murakaza neza, karibuni.
And as you know, ladies and gentlemen, today is meant to be a reflection on the notion of liberation as seen through Rwanda's and Africa's journeys, and contribute to the continent's awareness, and especially our youth, of the necessity, some would correctly say the imperative, to own our path towards social and economic transformation. Our mindset, our common solidarity, and our unwavering commitment to shaping a different reality, a different destiny for this continent are some of the key features that we know are needed and that you will see in the panel discussions to be taken place shortly. But allow us to start with the opening ceremony and welcoming remarks by the RPF-Inkotanyi Vice Chair, Honorable Bazivamo. Honorable Bazivamo, you're welcome to take the stage. And also please note that you have translations on different channels. Channel 1 is for English and channel 2 is for French.
Your Excellency, First Lady of the Republic of Rwanda, Your Excellency Benjamin Mkapa, former President of the United Republic of Tanzania, Dr. Chendai Fraser, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, the representative of EPDF, Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, Mr. Mohamed Zetenye, representative of the Chinese Communist Party, Honorable Ambassador Hongwei, friends of Rwanda, distinguished guests, honorable cadres of RPF, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of His Excellency Paul Kagame, Chairperson of RPF and President of the Republic of Rwanda, and on my own behalf, celebrating 50 years of RPF-Inkotanyi, it's a great pleasure and an honor to welcome you in this international conference on the theme Liberation and Transformation, Realizing a Dignified and Prosperous Africa. Welcome in this conference at this RPF-Inkotanyi headquarters here in Rusororo sector. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, this month, the Rwandan Patriotic Front is celebrating 30 years of experience, 30 years of its existence. Rwandans who saw the need to liberate Rwandans from a dictatorship and exclusion or discrimination-based power that had ruled the country since 1959, while keeping many Rwandans out of the motherland as refugees. This one formed RPF. Since the dictatorship in Rwanda had turned a deaf ear to all pleas of millions of refugees who were, for decades, forcibly exiled, the RPF had no option but to start an armed struggle. Thus, in October 1990, the armed wing of RPF, the Rwanda Patriotic Army, stormed the border town of Kagitumba and launched the armed struggle, which, under the visionary leadership of His Excellency Paul Kagame lasted a long and very hard 4 years liberation journey. From the time of the liberation struggle, the core message of the RPF has been consistent, and this is national unity, social and economic inclusion, and the pursuit of dignity Rwandans, and the pursuit of dignity for Rwandans and for Africans in general. It believed that these are the basic tenets around which total liberation of Rwanda and Africa depends on. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, although RPF ended the crucial phase of liberation in 1994, after ending the 4 years war and stopping the genocide against the Tutsi, which had claimed over 1 million innocent lives, the next level of liberation was to bring peace in the country, to resettle returning refugees and internally displaced persons, and to embark on a long journey of social and economic rehabilitation of the country. The rehabilitation included the restoration of physical infrastructure, public administration, addressing all the post-genocide effects, such as restore a quasi-non-existent justice system, heal and reconcile a traumatized society, and unite a totally disunited population. This called for thorough and consistent system that was inspired by, among other things, the National Conference, Village Urugwiro, in which Rwandans laid bare causes of a patterning situation. It is during this national conference that a consensus was agreed upon on systems and structures of a future leadership of this country. Ladies and gentlemen, today, we can safely say that all the basics for a peaceful, united, democratic, and reoriented Rwanda have been established. We are in a position to engage with stakeholders and business partners around Africa, promoting Pan-Africanism and the world as equals. We are no longer in Sinangufi. We have established a takeoff stage in the long-range struggle for self-resilience and ultimate transformation of Rwanda. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the 50th anniversary is an occasion to reflect on how the RPF can further advance Rwanda's ongoing socio-economic transformation for a total liberation and contribute to Africa's ideological, political, economic, and cultural independence. On this occasion, during this month, we held several activities ranging from a month-long talks and activities at the grassroots level, monthly community work activities around the country, and in a few days, we will be holding our National Congress. Based on RPF and Rwanda experience, I call upon African democracies and leaders to liberate themselves from the win and take all principle and to embrace the power sharing principle to ensure stronger citizens' participation, peace, and sustainable development of our continent. I would like to conclude by encouraging everyone here today to use this platform as an opportunity to reflect on Rwanda's and Africa's liberation journey, share experiences and views among ourselves, reflect on how best we can contribute in addressing centuries-old problems of African people, to reflect on how best to advocate for renewed urgency in accelerating Africa's socio-economic transformation and total liberation, and most importantly, to learn if and how we are passing on the mission of liberation to young people for future generation. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Honorable Vazivamo, Vice Chairman of the RPF-Inkotanyi, for these welcoming words, but also this broader picture of where RPF came from and where we are going, and also for the inspiring words, not only for Rwandans, but also for the whole Africa. And now, we are pleased to introduce His Excellency, Mr. Benjamin Mkapa, former President of the Republic of Tanzania, for today's keynote address. Your Excellency, welcome.
Mr. Vice Chairman of the RPF, Madam First Lady of the Republic of Rwanda, distinguished leadership of the Rwanda Patriotic Front, fellow invited guests, conference participants, ladies and gentlemen. I have been greatly honored to be invited to this conference, and I feel honored to have been asked to be a guest speaker. I know there are worthier retirees, regionally and continentally, who would have been more deserving. So I take this opportunity to say thank you most profoundly for your consideration. I thank the Vice President for outlining the liberation history of this country from the dictatorship and the genocide of the previous regime. It spares me the need to repeat what he has said, and it enables me to go straight into the RPF at 30. We are celebrating the landmark of 30 years of age. The CCM, of which I was chairman for 10 years, has observed 40 years this July. Both parties can be rightly credited with being liberation parties, but it was liberation under different circumstances. The founding parties of TANU and the Afro-Shirazi Party secured the liberation from British colonial rule to form the CCM. The RPF fought and won a liberation war and secured liberation from a despicable genocidal regime in an independent Rwanda. Both sought to establish unity, equality, and development for their citizens, all their citizens, and to put an end to all forms of discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, color, and faith, with results which are widely acknowledged and acclaimed. Rwanda is today a developing country which is a model of how to put an end to genocidal hatred and ethnic division. It is acknowledged as a model of constructing national unity from ethnic diversity. It is applauded for practically eliminating poverty, for modernizing the life of all, repeat, all its citizens in equality and dignity. It is recognized as a growing hub of regional trade and ICT development. It is commended for much more in both the developing and the so-called developed world. To achieve all these plaudits demands that we must ascribe it to the nationalism, the spirit of forgiveness, the spirit of brotherhood, and the hard work of its citizens. However, great success is the crown of good leadership. We say in Swahili, usione vinaelea vimeundwa. If you see a vehicle floating, it is because it has been designed and constructed. The exemplary achievements are owing to the leadership of President Paul Kagame. He is the conceptual architect, the designer, the inspirer, the implementer, the supervisor, the reviewer, the projector, and the accountable depositor of this remarkable accomplishment. In congratulating the RPF at 30, we must exceptionally congratulate and thank President Kagame for his nationalism, his Pan-Africanism, and his leadership. I say to you and to him, thank you, Mr. President. You have earned the respect of your citizens, the respect of the citizens of the East African region and of Africa as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, for the most part, the liberation of most African countries was achieved by political agitation, organized by political parties. The campaigns were rooted in the people and carried out by the people and led by selfless leaders. And the movement for freedom was very inclusive in aspirations. Even where armed struggle was resorted to, the liberation forces were supported openly and clandestinely by the general population. That is why what they fought was called People's War. At independence, there emerged the ruling parties and leaders who saw those ruling parties and leaders who saw the status as providing an opening for self-enrichment at the expense of the people. They downgraded the necessity for unity and non-discrimination. They constituted themselves a new ruling class, abetted and upheld by erstwhile colonial powers. They immersed themselves in group and ethnic politics to the point of fratricidal exchanges. In these instances, they turned independence into a door not to national self-determination, but to partisan self-aggrandizement and self-enrichment. Both the RPF and the CCM have avoided this route. Our leaders are not comprador rulers. they are servant leaders. Their people cherish their unity, equal opportunity and justice, development for all, and above all, national stability. Those principles and goals are enshrined in the party and national constitutions. And these are prerequisites for national self-respect and international esteem. African countries have witnessed 2 generations of independence. We have witnessed a range of political, economic, and social transformations. On the political front, we have seen a series of political coups d'etats in a number of countries. But today, we are proud to state that the overwhelming majority of African governments are civilian and democratically elected in multi-party elections. On the economic front, many of them are asserting ownership of their natural resources. On the social front, African people are affirming their cultural roots in song, in print, and in art. The resonant theme is that Africa is rising. I believe strongly, strengthened by my governance experience, that which kind of successful transformation depends greatly on the political framework obtaining. This political framework is determined by the philosophy and operating rules of political parties. They can destabilize the state, or they can stabilize the state. The political parties can destabilize the society, or they can prevent such destabilization. They can also destabilize the ownership of the factors and resources of development, or they can avoid this. In my view, to achieve development, political parties must needs define and agree on a national vision to the realization of which they commit themselves. Regardless of the strategy, they must not undermine national unity and the rule of law. The process must be all-inclusive. The meaning of the party structure must reflect this inclusivity, especially regarding the inclusion of women and youth. Under my presidency and CCM party leadership, I got the country to adopt Vision 2025. The process of formulating it was very inclusive. It included people from all political parties, civil societies, labor unions, women associations, youth organizations, and religious leaders. The vision originating from the government, the draft vision was adopted finally by a multi-party parliament. Implementation, alas, has been pursued by 2 successful administrations, and thus has proven to be a key to political, economic, and social stability of Tanzania. Such inclusivity must govern not just the decision of the policy of development. It must cover the process of arriving at major national decisions. And most important of these is the national constitution. Independence constitutions were constructed by or with the colonial power, and often in the image of political and cultural image of the colonizers. Not surprisingly, they proved to be recipes for political instability. Subsequently, as a result of popular revolt or popular agitation of earthquake proportions, the search for people-centered constitutions was embarked upon. The RPF and CCM have traveled this route. In Rwanda's case, it led to extensive popular consideration and parliamentary adoption of the present one. The Tanzania draft constitution has unfortunately stalled because the parliamentary process had to stop since the life of the 9th parliament ceased. I am confident the constitution-making process will resume. The point I want to make is that our two countries have demonstrated the best path to follow in constitution making. By rooting both process and content in the people, their history, and their aspirations, and affirming the imperative of self-development, self-determination, and self-reliance. The founding president of independent Ghana and early agent of African independence from colonial rule stated at the dawn of his country's freedom from colonial rule the following, quote, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked to the independence of the whole African continent," end of quote. My own party's constitution asserts as its members' first belief, and I quote, "All human beings are equal and Africa is one," unquote. Two important imperatives proceed from these beliefs. The first is a call for partnership and cooperation between independent African countries. The second is a call for economic integration between them. The call for African continental cooperation was planted and sprouted in the founding of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, which played a considerable role in the total political liberation of the continent. This, in turn, evolved into the African Union, expected to drive the faster all-round integration of African countries. The African Union adopted 3 years ago the Agenda 2063 as the charter and roadmap of Africa's political, economic, social, and cultural transformation. These are too early days to evaluate the implementation of Agenda 2063, but the charter shows us the way. The dynamism for Pan-African cooperation is, however, more manifest in the spirit of regional cooperation. Regional associations for transformation are manifest, from the SADC to the East African Community to ECOWAS and the Maghreb Union in North Africa. They mostly seek to harmonize their countries' security and defense, as well as to promote regional trade and investment. Progress on these fronts depends on the will of constituting members. The resolution of the election crisis in the Gambia by ECOWAS was, to my view, swift and unequivocal. It is a demonstration that regional unity and cooperation is a power. And one must pay tribute to the ECOWAS leaders. On the other hand, we have the Burundi crisis, which the East African Community have committed to help solve. I am a facilitator of that commitment in behalf of the mediator, President Yoweri Museveni. But I must concede to you that in this instance, the spirit is deficient. It's a case of the spirit being willing, but the flesh being weak. Nevertheless, I hold that the East African Community holds great promise the member countries sharing a common colonial history, geographical proximity, and considerable cultural affinity. The East African Community's nucleus was the British-ruled territories of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, which shared monetary, communication, harbors, and development research institutions. At independence, they formed the East African Community as the heartbeat of thriving and hoped-for all-round integration. Unfortunately, narrow national, selfish interests and personalities took over, and their strategy for breakup succeeded in 1974. The advantage of population numbers, plentifulness of resources, and the plea for integration was abandoned. Happily, the era was thrust back on the development agenda of these countries by successor leaders. The flame of regional cooperation was lit. The institutions of cooperation were redesigned to be instruments of integration. The East African Community was born. Membership was expanded in due course to include the republics of Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan. I am gratified that this rediscovery of the power of cooperation in the region took place in my presidency. It envisages growth into an East African federation and monetary union. This may look like a daunting and ambitious goal, but I believe it should not be lightly dismissed. I look to our newest members to shock we older ones into awareness of the current trends of globalization and so-called world economic transformation. The immediate past chief executive of the expanded East African Community, Dr. Sezibera, was a Rwandan citizen. He did an outstanding job of strengthening its formative institutions and riveting the attention of leaders to the challenge, strategy, and factors for fast-tracking East African integration and multifaceted development. I salute and thank him. I venture to stick my neck out now. I venture to say that on our continent, the pace of regional and ultimately Pan-African integration is slow for three reasons. The first is a leadership which is imbued with self-aggrandizement fueled by excessive nationalism. The second is the failure to accept that cooperation demands a give and take readiness. The third is the influence that regional groupings elsewhere in the world, such as the European Union and Mercosur, have on our developmental perspective. In the first case, leaders fear a diminishing of their power and wealth in a new framework of political and economic governance. In the second, it is the drive to limit the degree of national sacrifice for a larger constellation of dividends in an enlarged framework of development. And thirdly, is the failure to realize that the regional political and economic groupings of the developed world are a product of the exploitation over centuries of the resources of present-day developing countries, especially in Africa. But we must remember, African countries have no global territories to colonize. They can, however, organize themselves in unison to self-develop. They need to evolve a development matrix of cooperation on their own. Regional cooperation and integration is thus an instrument for accelerating the development of individual member states, simultaneously enabling them to negotiate more favorably the terms of their inescapable participation in a world order dominated by the European and American architects. It should also serve to free us to construct our own model of development. President Kagame's statement to European and foreign inquisitors that, and I quote him, I think, "We are what we are," unquote. This should stimulate us to proclaim our identity. I am not arguing for summary rejection of foreign external influence. Rather, I am making the case for an African renaissance. In our understanding of growth, the parameters of transformation, and the distinctness of our identity in the new world order. When Rwanda deployed its traditional Gacaca justice system, it exemplified the revolutionary pragmatism we need. Now, the torchbearers of this parcel of development will have to be the youth, and it is the responsibility of those in power to prepare them positively and practically to take over. Development requires capacity to transform resources into goods and services. This in turn demands education and skills. The challenge to provide relevant education must be addressed institutionally, academically, in terms of curriculum, design, and philosophically. As the independence and post-independence era leaders age or retire, the youth are clamoring for their posts. They reject the appeasement of their being, quote, future, unquote, leaders. They want leadership now. The youth must in particular be taught the history of our liberation. Our achievements will not come about by imitating our colonizers. The youth, with such an education, will then accept the challenge of Agenda 2063. Whatever the complexion of the political profile in our countries, whether it's dominant party or strongly multi-party, the youth must be accorded representation, as must be the women, as a matter of right, not because these groups are destined to be the hardest hit victims of political instability and social strife. The saga of the Arab Spring early this decade is sufficient testimony. In my country's parliament, there is provision for special women's seats. And in the CCM constitution, there is special provision for seats for women and youth. Because political parties basically seek popular power to form government and to govern the country, it is necessary in the interest of national stability that in their constitutions and election manifestos, parties reflect the national ethos. This imperative is often ignored or underrated during elections in multi-party Africa. But freedom is not equal to license. And even where the playing field is open, political conduct must not disturb peace and stability. It must respect the law. Because where there is instability, there can be no development. Investments, both local and foreign, are scared, production is stalled, markets are shriveled, and incomes decline. Such civic education must go side by side with transformation. So, what is a development transformation? What is the development transformation which we in Africa earnestly should seek? It has many faces and many phases, from poverty eradication to industrialization. I believe the paramount step is the elimination of hunger, ignorance, and disease. When these afflictions and oppressions are ended, we will have begun the journey of transformation towards sustainable development. At the first international conference I attended as president, aid for development or development assistance was on the agenda. I made this point. For a developing country, when a citizen or country is food full up, that citizen can think and execute measures for food sustainability. He can seek water for nutrition and rarely require health attention. When a citizen is health insured, he can concentrate on food self-sufficiency projects. When the citizen is knowledgeable, he will know how to ward off all these pestilences. I argued for these aid priorities in designing development assistance. I don't think I was taken seriously. A few years ago, at a conference here in Kigali, I praised the RPF leadership and government policy on people's development. I said because of its achievements in universal education, universal health care, universal food self-sufficiency, Rwanda was more developed than some of the old developed countries. I was surprised to see how extensively my observation was tweeted on the internet. I was surprised because I thought I had stated the obvious. Development must be people-centered and liberate inclusively. Otherwise, it will not be sustainable. An important condition for successful transformation is education for self-reliance. We are quick to assert our independence, but too often we reveal an addiction to Eurocentric thought, values, and way of life. We exhibit the bond of the way of doing things and constructing development plans with the eyes of our former colonial masters and present-day so-called developed countries. Thus, as Ghana's President Nana Akufo-Addo said 2 weeks ago at the back of the Africa-Europe Conference in Ivory Coast, we have a mindset of dependence that foreign aid will drive development. No, it will not. Self-reliance will. Self-reliance on our minds, our muscles, and our resources. Yes, we can do it. We need to rid ourselves of the mindset of developmental dependence. There is a saying in Swahili, favors and slave. Favors and slave. What does liberation and development require of us going forward? Accept the reality of history and past destiny. Africa is 54 independent African countries. But we must work for the lively realization that fundamentally we are Africans in designated geographical territories. If I recall properly, I remember President Kagame himself saying that he is an African who happens to be in Rwanda. We must then be propelled to cement this interterritorial Africanism in all spheres: political, economic, social, and cultural. We must plead and assert incessantly, proactively, for integration, beginning with our region. We must equally ardently strive to lay the foundation blocks of a united Africa. We must strive to persuade the nation-states of Africa to surrender progressively some of their sovereignty, political, economic, and social, for a greater entity, a united, dynamic African Union. An African Union denouncing genocide on the continent and the wider world, pressing for a review of the global economic architecture so that it releases more equitable outcomes for us. With such engagement, there is the possibility of developing a united and influential Africa. We shall be heard. Change of both our consideration and our rights will be respected. That is the challenge of the legacy of present leadership and the heritage of the young generations. As Mwalimu, my founding president would say, it can be done. Play your part. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you again, Your Excellency. Allow me to try my Kiswahili. Asante sana. And it is really a privilege and an honor to be in this room today and listen to words full of wisdom, but also a very promising feature, a Pan-Africanism feature for Africa, that it will be very inclusive and human-centered. But before we move to the next program, Your Excellency, if you allow, while we are back there, some young men and women expressed their needs to ask some questions and share their thoughts after remarks. So if you allow us, we will open the floor for a few questions. Thank you very much. Turagira ngo niba abafite ibitekerezo n'ibibazo nkuko mwabidusabye turi hariya, mwakwegera protokole mukabaza ibibazo byanyu murasa ku ntego kugira ngo dushobore kujya muri gahunda ikurikiyeho. Protokole mwadufasha mukareba bazamuye ibiganza kugira ngo mubegere.
We understand that there are a few people that wanted to ask questions on the left side of the room.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you very much, President Mkapa, for your very inspiring talk. My name's Frederick Golova Mtebi. I'm Ugandan and Rwandan. I would like to revisit a few things you said. And I'm asking these bearing in mind that you presided over Tanzania's continued shift from socialism and one-party rule to a market-led economy and a multi-party dispensation. Now, you did mention the importance of servant leadership, inclusion or inclusivity in decision-making, and avoidance of self-aggrandizement and self-enrichment. Now, if I may ask, what other things did you find useful in performing that very important function you performed, but also as somebody who has been in retirement for a few years now, somebody who observes what's going on around our own region and the continent, what words of advice would you give to young leaders, current and future, who are going to seek to further transform Africa? Because the transformation of Africa has not ended. And in some places, it hasn't even started. Thank you very much.
in addition to the things I outlined as being basic to good governance, the participation of the people in institution making, in policy making. Two things I particularly learned in due course. One was establishing the habit of regular review of implementation. It's very easy to move from one project to another, from one public rally to another. While you are shouting your heads off and cheering one another, nothing happens on the ground. So that regular review of implementation is key. Secondly, in leadership circles in both government and the party, it is necessary to be open and for leaders to be ready to listen. It's very easy to give instructions, but you can't be all-knowing. And sometimes those outside your circle may observe things which you can't see yourself. So you must make a regular habit of consultation, but also a regular habit of listening. That's important. What have I learned since I retired? The same factors. We don't meet often enough. We don't talk often enough. We start as if there has been no past. We instruct or embark on projects as if they will be carried out thoroughly in your lifetime, let alone your leadership time. And that will not do. That's why I talk about preparation and the readiness to accept responsibility. We are quick to ask, especially for the youth, quick to say, look, you can't keep postponing your surrender of your position to us youth, because the future will never come for us if you go on like that. Give it to us now. But preparation is important. And finally, for the youth, I emphasize that it's not enough to claim positions of leadership. You must demonstrate first an interest in the party, demonstrate not only in knowing the Constitution, but in practical demonstration of application of their policies. That is where you learn what not to do and what to do. And if you do that, you will find yourself slowly going up the responsibility ladder. You may start at the branch level, you will wind up at the regional level, and pretty soon the top leadership level will recognize your work, your talent, and what you hold in store for your country. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think what His Excellency has mentioned touches on a lot of things that we do in Rwanda as well. So we believe in the same values. The review of implementations, that's imihigos, and also consultations, and we even go a little further by speaking of consensus, which is enshrined in our constitutions, because the idea of consulting everyone really plays into creating a foundation that speaks to all of the population, yet trying to strive for a consensus to make sure that we get to the best solution while maintaining harmony between the people in Rwanda. So thank you very much, Your Excellency. If there's another question, yes, can you please stand up?
Thank you very much. My name is Alan Senyonga. I am an East African. I listened carefully to what you said, and you mentioned a lot about integration and African unity. So my question is Africa prepared to respond to global threats to its sovereignty, such as the ICC? Thank you.
No, it is not.
Sorry, I don't think we are very well positioned to challenge the developed world architecture, not only in the ownership of our natural resources, because they are ours, but they are not really owned by us. They are in our territory, but they are owned by externals. We can't even define the terms. If you define them too nationally, then you get conspiracies to remove you so that someone more pliant can come in. We have not been party to the organization of the mechanics and the institutions of carrying on cooperation or trade or other forms of exchange. It's all give and take to us. And so, but more importantly is, I don't see enough seriousness of the continental organization, the African Union, or even of regional organization, to take in hand the challenge of finding solutions ourselves. First defining those solutions ourselves, finding solutions ourselves, explaining to our people the problems and the solutions, and then mobilizing them to the spirit of participation in their solution. No, all I hear are resolutions, meetings and meetings, conferences and conferences, so on. If you are to ask the ordinary citizen, what does the summit of the East African community mean to you? What has it changed over the last 3 years? They will probably tell you nothing. Yes, because we don't take those projects down to earth so that they can feel that they own those projects. So I don't think we are positioned really, but we should be positioned. And the way to do it is that, I don't know why we respect each other so much that we don't talk to each other. What kind of thing is this? Anyway, thank you. Thank you. Don't let me get in.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Yes, indeed, we have to speak to each other. We have to know that the idea of not owning what we're doing will only lead us to accepting it from outside, which there's nothing, as we often say, there's nothing wrong with working in good partnerships with external partners, but the drive of what we do will be coming from ourselves, from Africa. And Your Excellency, we strongly hope here in Rwanda that 2018 is going to be a good year for the African Union. We will work very hard for that. Thank you. A last question before we move to the panel. Yes, in the back. In the far back.
Thank you. My name is Nyiramarisa Denise. I'm a student in IPRC Kigali campus. Then my question is, what are you doing as the leaders that always want to transform Africa to the problem of Libyans refugees? Thank you.
I hope next year we will relocate the problem of the refugees in Libya, relocate them from Europe, the aspiration to go to Europe, into an aspiration to remain in Africa. And I'm hoping that next year, African leaders will really sit down and seriously see what they can do to retain their people in their countries, or to allow other people from other countries to come and find a living in another African country. It is a shame. Someone said to me the other day, why are you complaining so much about this? I say, this is a question of the slave trade in reverse. We are going to Europe now in order to make use of them. They came and carried us in bulk to go and develop America and Europe and so on. Now it's our turn to invade them in massively in order to exploit their resources, their knowledge, and their opportunities for work. That's nonsense. Africa, we belong here. If you listen to the President Akufo-Addo, he really impressed me at this public hearing he made with Macron standing on his side, where he said, look,
in the 17th century or the 18th century, the greatest refugees were Italian and Irish. They were refugees to America. But they were running away from famine, from underdevelopment, and whatnot. It says today, you don't see such a flow of refugees from Italy or Ireland. Why? Because they have developed there of their own resources, and they have enough to do, not to want to seek life as far away as America. I think by the same token, if we can organize ourselves from making use of our land, making use of our resources, through our cooperatives, through innovation, etc., we can retain a lot of these people who think there is a better life in Europe. I myself honestly don't understand how they can think they'll be better off in freezing Europe than in comfortable Africa. That can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Your Excellency. I know there are many young men and women who wants to ask more questions. So we're going to give the last chance for the last question because we have to go for the next on our program. So maybe on the other side, because we've been getting questions from the right side, can we get some question from the left? At the back.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. My name is Gaspar Twagirayezu. I am Rwandan. As you said, we have seen some progress in integration efforts, and this is with a goal to allow free movement of people and also increase intra-Africa trade. But also at the same time, we have seen some resistance against the same movement from both inside and also outside Africa. So, Your Excellency, in your view, what can Africa as a continent do to overcome that resistance in order to pave way for a more united and prosperous Africa?
There is movement, it is true, and I will stick my neck out. Regionally, there is a movement of both people and livestock, which may cause misunderstandings between member states. The principal reason is, with regard to livestock, is because the livestock keep us, we don't keep the livestock. So they move and we follow. They move and we follow. We don't provide them with their feed because the feed depends entirely on nature. So wherever their nature, that's where the livestock is. And wherever they go, you must follow. But clearly, the territory is finite. And we must have, after all these studies, you know, we have veterinary schools, veterinary research, and so on. We must turn now into, Waswahili tunasema wafugaji, sio wachungaji. Fuga, you can get even more income with fewer numbers than you can by taking them all over the place. There's a story in my country where during our founding president's time, the Maasais, you know, started moving all over the country. They came up to the southwest of the country on the border with Zambia. Of course, they were a free country and they came around there, but they didn't know this business about borders. So they crossed into Zambia. So we had to follow them and tell them, hey, this is not where you are supposed to be. They said, why? Isn't this Nyerere country? So, so for them, the whole of Africa was Nyerere country and they were Nyereres, so they could feed their animals everywhere, wherever they wanted. No, you can't. We must have serious livestock development policies which take into account about how much territory, what market, technology, and so on. I hope something like that is happening here, but I'm very frank to say that it's not happening enough in my country. And that's why you had a couple of weeks ago, there was, the media may have blown it out of hand, but 1,500 head of cattle crossed the border in the north because there was no feedlot out there. And the new Minister of Livestock decided that the animals should be seized and auctioned. The Kenyan owners were furious. They said this is not good friendliness and it's not integration. But again, I emphasize the real thing is policy and modernizing livestock keeping. Let's talk about that and see whether it cannot reduce the problem. Movement of people. I think the movement of people, particularly because of all these threats of crime and terrorism and whatnot, all we need to do is to have clear identities of the nationalities, present nationalities, before we have the East African one. And then you can satisfy yourself they're not coming to cause mayhem in the country. Question of job creation, seeking jobs and so on, that is another thing that should be tackled. But the key thing is, we are letting, I'm a former journalist myself, of a sort. I'm a former journalist, but we're allowing these problems to be discussed by journalists who don't know how to govern, what it takes to govern, who don't know how to keep livestock, who don't know all this. Why do the politicians and the principal administrators, the civil service, why don't they give these questions an honest analysis and projections? This is where the youth can be challenged. Criticize, innovate, suggest. I don't think you'll be molested. You'll be helping us to get closer together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much once again, Your Excellency. Young men, young ladies, we have to move to our next in our program. But definitely, if I have to say what I've learned today, preparation is very important. Speaking to each other. We belong to Africa, and of course we need modernized policies for our Pan-Africanism program or speech. So now, Diana, what's next?
What's next? I'm sorry, what's next is, as you have guessed, the high-level panel that has been prepared for today. And the topic is driving national transformation and realizing Africa's full potential, which is really building on everything that has been exchanged with His Excellency, the President Kappa, and the audience. So before we move to this discussion, allow me to introduce Andrew Mwenda, who's a journalist, founder and managing director of the independent magazine in Uganda. He will come and set the scene for what is to follow. He will lay the background and the foundation for everyone to be able to build on. And while Andrew is coming to the stage, I just want to remind the panelists that they should get prepared to slowly move to the stage so that we can start the conversations afterwards. Andrew? Thank you.
His Excellency, our guest of honor today, Mr. Benjamin Mkapa, who is a journalist like me, and your dear wife, the Vice Chairman of the RPF, the First Lady of Rwanda, invited delegations from other countries and political parties, fellow RPF members, fellow Rwandans, ladies and gentlemen. First, before I came here, I was angry, threatening to sue the RPF because on my card, I had even hired a lawyer. They put there, Andrew Mwenda, Uganda. And I said, look, I am an honorary citizen of Rwanda. That is one. Two, I want to speak in my capacity as Deputy Secretary General of the RPF. The party does not have a deputy, so I appointed myself to that role. And of course, not to forget that the President appointed me Colonel General of the RDF. So I'll speak in those three capacities. I want to give a background to set the scene for this discussion, the pace for this discussion, on what is it that has defined RPF, because RPF is a very unique political party. In Kinyarwanda we would say, ubudasa bwa RPF. Just look around you. We are having this event in such a magnificent conference hall. It is not normal to find a political party, most especially on this continent, with this kind of hall. The RPF has a business arm called Crystal Ventures. It is one of the most successful businesses in Africa. That's a very unique thing. So, in setting this space, I want to try to explain what is it that defines this political party. Let me begin in its later years, when they launched the armed struggle to liberate Rwanda. Most rebel movements in Africa and elsewhere survive politically and succeed because they launch their armed activities in a region where the population, either for ideological or, most especially in Africa, ethnic reasons, identifies with their cause. In the case of the RPF, it launched the struggle when it lacked popular support in the areas where it was fighting. That made this party begin from a strategic disadvantage. 2, most successful rebel movements in Africa have enjoyed the patronage of a foreign power bankrolling them. In the case of the RPF, there wasn't any foreign power. There was a poverty-stricken power called Uganda, but the support from Uganda was deliberately constrained because President Yoweri Museveni felt that the RPF should develop her own internal capacity to prosecute her struggle rather than depend on an external patron. 3, many other rebel movements, you have seen them in Liberia and Somalia, they depend on rich minerals. They capture a gold mine in Bujumai or wherever it was in Sierra Leone and Liberia, make a lot of money and use this money to finance the war. The RPF didn't have any of that. 3, the RPF was fighting a very effective military government, strongly backed by a world power called France. France not only gave money, weapons, but it also trained the army and had its own army officers on the ground as instructors. You can watch the videos, instructing how to fight. 4, the average length of these civil wars is about 10 years. The RPF, in spite of the aforementioned disadvantages and against a deeply entrenched military government, was able to succeed in 3.5 years. That is unprecedented. If we had time, I would have told you the story how RPF could have won this struggle in 1993 and why it was stopped. If I find 2 minutes at the end, I may add this insightful story. Therefore, for RPF to succeed against these odds required extraordinary leadership ability and organization. This was required not just to succeed, but just to survive. Now, we all know that the initial attack by the RPF degenerated into a disaster. The commander, General Fred Rwigema, was killed on the second day. The RPF was totally, the RPA at that time, the armed wing was badly beaten. Hope turned into disillusionment, high morale turned into defeatism, and confidence turned into self-doubt. It is at this critical moment of defeat, disillusionment, and self-doubt that a man called Paul Kagame arrived on the scene. He has told me the story of how when he arrived at the camp, he found a sick bay where tens or hundreds of the injured and dying were lying next to the dead bodies. The situation was a disaster. How does one reorganize, inspire, and lead such a demoralized, defeated force and launch it into battle? And within 3.5 years, secure a decisive military victory. I want to say that this required extraordinary fortitude, discipline, managerial and leadership ability, strategic foresight, doggedness, decisive decision-making, and stubborn resolution. And I think President Paul Kagame embodied these and more, because to lead such a movement, you needed to organize diplomatically, you needed to organize logistically, you needed to organize financially, you needed to handle politics. The combination of things that you have to do is complex and complicated. I have a friend called Professor Jeremy Weinstein at Stanford University. He has studied rebel movements, and these are the ideas he presents. He says, leaders of rebel movements face adverse selection problems. Recruits come to you. They could be infiltrators from the government side. That's why many rebel movements choose the trust of identity over the pool of ideology. So you are not sure why a person is joining you. The second thing is, most recruits could be joining because they're expecting a quick payoff. Maybe because there is gold or diamond is a rich mineral which can be exploited, sold to make money. When a rebel force is launched in an area with rich minerals like Congo, it tends to attract opportunists who are seeking a quick financial payoff by capturing a gold mine, and these opportunists tend to crowd out high commitment individuals. But if a movement is launched in a resource-constrained environment, like the RPF did, there was no rich mineral, there was no foreign power bankrolling the RPF, it means that the movement will tend to attract people with high levels of commitment to the ideology and political objectives of the organization. So in the case of the RPF, if you are an opportunist looking for a quick payoff, initially they were beaten, so the hope of success was very low. The opportunists ran away. There was no rich mineral to exploit and make money. The other opportunists who remained ran away. 3, the conditions in the Virunga Mountains were so harsh that sometimes the RPF officers could wake up in the morning and find soldiers on guard have frozen to death. General Kabarebe is here to bear me out on this. General Kabarebe, am I telling the truth? Yes. Soldiers would freeze to death. So the physical conditions were very harsh. You needed to be physically and mentally strong to survive in this struggle. So the result, therefore, of these conditions, lack of a rich mineral, lack of a foreign patron to bankroll the organization, and the harsh physical conditions, crowded the opportunists out, and therefore the selection process tended to encourage people with a strong ideological commitment to the RPF's political objectives to be the most dominant force in the organization. And therefore we need to understand this organization from that context. It was fighting a deeply entrenched and disciplined military government, which in a resource-scarce environment, where the chances of success were very low, where political support was little or non-existent, and in those conditions, it required extraordinary organization and leadership to succeed. Because of this environment, there was selection of the right cadres, politically committed, physical and mentally strong, able to withstand anything. Therefore, the consequence was that an organization that emerged was made up of individuals who were politically committed to the struggle, who were mentally disciplined, who were physically very strong. I was told by President Kagame one time that 65% of the resources financing this struggle came from refugees in the camps. Again, it shows that poor people, if poor people are given the right incentives, they can contribute massively to their own betterment. Even today, the RPF does not go around asking people abroad to finance its activities. This building you see was built by the resources of the people of Rwanda who are members of the RPF. So the following characteristics evolved out of the context I have laid out. 1, a culture of self-reliance, which is one of our themes today. A culture of self-reliance, this belief that we can do it ourselves. This is not just a belief in President Kagame, it is rooted in every single member of the RPF that you will meet, especially those in the leadership positions. 2nd, a penchant for fiscal discipline, a strong commitment to fiscal discipline. that RPF does not waste her resources. 3, a deep-seated hostility to corruption and abuse of collective resources. In this organization and in this country, if you put your fingers into the public purse and take resources meant for everybody for yourself, everybody here knows the evil that would be visited upon you. The fourth element that defines the RPF is suspicion and mistrust of the international community. Because the international community has tended always to intervene in Rwanda to seek to define the interests of Rwandans rather than allow Rwandans to define their own interest. Yet when Rwandans confronted apartheid here for so many years, the international community was indifferent to their cause. When they launched the struggle for liberation, it became hostile to their cause. When they faced the genocide, the international community ran away. These conditions created suspicion and mistrust of the intentions of the international community. Finally, the fourth quality that emerged in the RPF is a high level of internal cohesion. I think this is one of the most coherent political parties in terms of its internal organization that you can meet anywhere in the world. So, to conclude what I'm saying, I want to make a reference to, having seen all this, what makes this organization and the government that it leads exceptionally successful? There is an economist called George Akerlof. He won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2001, and he wrote a book with a lady whose name I cannot remember. The book is called Identity Economics. And the book is about what exactly makes an individual, an organization, or a country successful. George Akerlof says, A, it is not excellent professional skills per se. You can be an excellent lawyer in terms of skill, or engineer, or journalist. But you may not apply your skill to your job to produce the right result. He says it is not even incentive pay. It's not how much money a person is paid that makes them perform very well. So which means these hefty payments of American CEOs is really misleading. He says it is something called identity. When a person or an organization or a country makes that leap in identity and says, I am a good plumber, and that is the example he uses. I am a good journalist, I'm an excellent lawyer. When anybody makes that leap in identity and identifies themselves as excellent in something, then they want to see their identity in the products of their work. If you say I'm an excellent plumber, you want to see excellent plumbing, you want to see yourself in your work. I'm an excellent journalist, I want to see excellence in the product of my work. I am an excellent military commander, you want to see that. So it is that identity that makes, that leap in identity that creates the best results. I agree with Professor George Akerlof on this. In Rwanda here, there has been that leap in identity. If you follow the speeches of the president here, emphasizing Ndi Umunyarwanda. Everywhere you go, I have attended seminars and boot camps for the youth, the statement that Ndi Umunyarwanda, to identify yourself to belong to Rwanda. That's a serious leap in identity. You see, previously you were either Mututsi or a Mhutu or a Twa. Now you are Ndi Umunyarwanda. 2, second layer of identity. We are rebuilding our country. 3rd, agachiro. We are people of dignity. Actually, that is 2. So if you say Ndi Umunyarwanda, 2, I am a dignified Munyarwanda, ndafite agachiro, right? That is a serious leap in identity. Those 2 things, 1, Ndi Umunyarwanda, 2, a dignified one, a Munyarwanda with agachiro or with dignity, leads to this sense that we are rebuilding our country. Now let me tell you something interesting. Kenya is perhaps 30 years ahead of Rwanda in terms of human skills, just to have the right personnel, human beings who can do great things. Uganda may be 15 to 20 years ahead of Rwanda. Rwanda has very poor skills. limited experience. In Kenya, you can find a permanent secretary in the ministry who has been there. He's 60, has been there for the last 40 years. In Uganda, same thing. Here, maybe a permanent secretary is in the early 30s. They don't have experience. Why do public institutions in Rwanda perform better than those in Kenya or Uganda? I think it is because of this identity, to say, Ndi Umunyarwanda, ndafite agaciro, and I'm rebuilding my country. That sense of identity. So I want So I want to conclude by saying that the RPF has been successful because not just President Paul Kagame, but the team of people he has worked with and the population of Rwanda have all been mobilized around this identity that one, turi abanyarwanda, turafite agaciro, we are rebuilding our country. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. Self-reliance, self-discipline, a sense of identity, leadership, all of those characteristics, I have to say, going back to what Andrew was saying in the beginning, they were such a core part of what we were doing during the RPF liberation struggle. And I think we should never, ever minimize the resolution and the commitment. Because for us, there was no plan B. And it's not that there was no plan B because we wouldn't know where to go. It was because we were also fighting the right fight. One of having a homeland for all Rwandans, built into that national identity that Andrew so kindly summarized. So now, as you have seen, our panel has moved to the stage. And I would like to introduce Louise Kanyonga, who is the moderator of this panel. She's one of our young leaders and the Registrar General of the Rwandan Development Board. So I think everybody feels comfortable now, and I can safely leave the floor to Louise to conduct the whole session. Louise, on to you.
Thank you very much, Diana. And thank you, Andrew Mwenda, for excellently setting the scene for our conversation this afternoon. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, welcome. This is a conversation that we're going to be having on realizing national transformation. How do we drive national transformation to make sure that we're realizing Africa's full potential? As Diana said, my name is Louise Kanyonga, and I am absolutely honored and privileged that I will be moderating this high-level panel session. We have a stellar panel with us this morning, this afternoon, to help guide the conversation that we'll be having. And as Diana said, this conversation really builds on and expands on some of the theme areas that have been discussed by our honorable speakers this morning. And so I will now introduce our distinguished panelists. I apologize, I will not be able to do justice to your several great accomplishments and the many hats that you wear in the short time that we have. On my immediate left is Professor Shaka. Professor Shaka is the CEO of the Rwanda Governance Board, which is an independent institution that is tasked with promoting the compliance with the government of Rwanda's governance principles. And under his leadership, the Rwanda Governance Board has been able to develop what we call the Rwanda Governance Scorecard that is intended to drive high institutional performance and delivery. You're welcome, Professor. To his left is Dr. Jendai Fraser. Dr. Fraser is the managing partner of Africa Exchange Holdings and the president of 50 Ventures LLC, which are a couple of the entities that own the East Africa Commodities Exchange that was actually established here in Kigali. Dr. Fraser also formerly served in the US government as the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. Thank you, Dr. Fraser, for being here. On her left is Mr. Diko Mukete. He is currently a consultant with a special interest in economic and financial governance issues, And he is just recently retired from a 25-year career in the African Development Bank. And he actually spent 3 of those years as the AFDB's resident representative in Rwanda. And he has truly become a friend of Rwanda. So perhaps I should have introduced you by your Rwandan name, Mugabo. Yeah, but you're very welcome back to Rwanda, Mr. Mukete. To his left is Dr. Jean-Paul Kimonyo. Dr. Kimonyo is an author, a researcher, and a senior advisor in the Office of the President. He's also an expert on conflict and post-conflict reconstruction and has authored 2 books, Rwanda, un génocide populaire, and Rwanda Demain. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Kimonyo. And finally, we have James Mwangi. James is the executive director of the Dahlberg Group. He's also currently a partner with the Dahlberg Global Development Advisors, and previously he served as the global managing partner of the consulting business of the Dahlberg Group. And he's also a 2013 Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum. It's good to have you, James. So ladies and gentlemen, that is our panel. Now, Rwanda is one of the best places in the world to be a woman, and so naturally, women first. I'll start with you, Dr. Fraser. And I think from the conversations that we've had this morning, and also from what's been happening around the world, transformation, as we're speaking of transformation, this is really a narrative that is emerging more and more. Because previously when we spoke of Africa, you spoke of Africa's growth and Africa's development. But today we're speaking of transformation, and I think that it's extremely important that we distinguish between growth and transformation. Now, you have a very wide experience in Africa and in Africa's affairs, having served as an ambassador and also with the Bureau of African Affairs. So from that vantage point, what would you say truly constitutes transformation in the African context? And are there some practical cases on the continent that stood out for you to embody that definition? And are there lessons that we can learn from those?
Thank you very much, Louise. And let me just start by saying congratulations to the RPF for 30 years, on your 30-year anniversary. I'm very honored to be here and to be able to participate. When I think about transformation, I go back many years, back to 200,000 years ago. And I think that's the first and most profound transformation that's taken place on the African continent, and that is, of course, Homo sapiens coming into being, i.e. human beings. Homo sapien means wise man, and wise man, the human race started right here on the African continent. That was a fundamental transformation. 40,000 years ago, that human being left Africa and colonized the planet. And so the very first transformation, I think, is, in fact, being the birth mother of all of humanity. That's important also because Homo sapien means wise man. And so I think that the first order of transformation is wisdom. The first order of transformation is self-awareness. Because one of the defining features of human beings is the capacity to speak, to imagine, to build, to develop culture through bonding collectively with each other, having a language to communicate, and having an imagination to think about and envision our future. That's a defining feature of human beings, and that started here in Africa. So that's where I start on transformation and the need for self-awareness. Then as I speak as a political scientist, I think about political development on the continent. And particularly, of course, out of the human beings come civilizations, the many different kingdoms and empires on the African continent. President Nkapa, I think, has already spoken so eloquently and thoroughly about that transformation from, colonial rule, slavery, colonial rule, pre-independence. But the way in which I would like to bring it up is to talk about how Africa's development fit with global affairs. If you think about moving past that, the slavery, the Arab slave trade, or the Arabs trading in African slaves, I should say, or the European slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, or Europeans trading in Africans. When we get past that, which is really a manifestation of internal division on the continent being exploited by external parties. When you get past slavery and the colonization into the real political development where political parties play such a key role, it's the immediate post-colonial independence mobilization, a mobilization of youth, mobilization of the whole society in very strong liberation parties, starting really from 1957 with Ghana getting its independence. But what you see is that those independence movements come from a rejection of colonization, but it also comes from a weakening of the West at the end of the Second World War. And so there is this dynamic between Africa's capacity and ability to move forward significantly in an accelerated fashion, in a transformative fashion, and what's going on globally. And so I take that first major push from the post-colonial independence period, where we did see then, a movement forward, but then a bit of regression, i.e. certain dictatorships, military rule, coup d'etats, et cetera. Not 100%, of course, but progress and then moving backwards to the second major transformation, which is really the end of the Cold War, or what I would call the second phase of liberation struggles, moving towards multi-party democracy. Again, you see a weakening, because during the Cold War, it was, in fact, Western countries that kept certain dictators in power to their ends, right? It was, East-West battle, but with the end of the Cold War, the aspirations of Africans for greater freedom and greater democracy, and I will use that word, was able to emerge further. And so I think, again, that dynamic. Now I think, when I think about the third wave of that political development, it really has to do with accountability. It has to do with good governance, and it has to do with inclusion. And then that's an aspiration that's emerging from Africa. Independent of what's going on in the world, but what is going on in the world that could allow for that acceleration, that transformation, and that's a multipolar world. After the Cold War, clearly the United States was the dominant power globally. And in many ways, the world was, the West was in charge, in power. Today, what we're seeing is really multipolarity. And the question becomes, how does Africa take advantage of a shift in global affairs, frankly, a weakening of the West and a disarray in many ways, to move forward with the aspirations of the people of the continent. And so I think that that's the dynamic. Now, what is the real fundamental challenge? I think the fundamental challenge, or two of the fundamental challenges, I should say, are a question of state building and a question of nation building. And that's been there from the very beginning, from the 1960s, and I would even say before. And really what we're faced with is weak institutionalization of African states and fragmented identity of the nation. And so when you think about state building, the balance is how does African countries achieve a monopoly over the legitimate use of force, i.e. against external and internal challengers who would try to, overthrow a place violently, and also build a collective identity, a national identity. Because often the internal challenge is about division among people and communities. The same thing that led to the slave trade, right, is the same thing today that could undermine sovereignty and state building at the national level. And how does Africa build that institutional strength and that collective identity to also be able to withstand external attacks on sovereignty? And so I think addressing this balance between state building and nation building is going to continue to be a critical challenge for young people in terms of building political parties. Now, when you ask the question of what are some of the examples, I'm an academic, first and foremost. I'll speak as a business person later, but I'm an academic first and foremost. I would look at, of course, the RPF and the NRM, right? I mean, I think Andrew was talking about, you know, Museveni wanted the RPF to build its own internal capacity, but the RPF helped build the NRM, right? I mean, they fought that Ugandan war, right? I mean, let's be clear. And so, you know, look at those two liberation movements. The EPRDF is a critical liberation movement that is absolutely in control of its economic transformation, but how does it deal with nation building, right? The huge challenge of bringing about that collective national identity is key there. Look at the ANC and the MPLA, two other liberation movements. How are they dealing with the issues of corruption and state capture? And, you know, these are challenges that they're going to have to, I mean, Andrew and President Kappa both talked about, you know, individuals and, you know, trying to benefit against the will of the collective. So how are these two liberation parties? Look at ZANU-PF. I think that's an instructive one as well. Strong party, an extremely strong party, but lost its way in many ways. Can it find its way back? I think that CCM itself is a critical party. For me, it's a liberation party because CCM created a platform for many of these African liberation movements to actually be able to exist by giving them space, land, ideological leadership, financial contributions, so that they can actually carry out that liberation movement, especially in Southern Africa. And also has addressed the transition of leadership from President Nyerere onward. And so I think these are all liberation movements that will be instructive. And if I were a professor, I would set up certain comparisons and push certain questions to young people so that they can understand their history and learn from it as we go forward, because the point about political development, it is never linear and in one direction. There's always a back and forth. And so to conclude, I would say that for me, the key ingredients for transformation, particularly on the political side, is, as I said again, self-awareness, being that wise man, embodying what it means to be a human being, i.e. imagining a future with clarity, and that's where ideology becomes important and planning becomes important. Yes, 20-year plans are important, but 50-year plans and 100-year plans and 200-year plans are important. So put ourselves in the mindset of 20,000 years of history, and where are we going to be 20,000 years from today, right? What's that? I mean, we can't envision it, but I think President Kappa said it very well, which is we have to think beyond our lifetime. You know, we have to think beyond 2 lifetimes. We have to think in terms of generations upon generations. The second, I think, key ingredient is that there has to be self-determination. And so as the world changes, there has to be a clarity about how Africa can use global change to advance its cause, to advance what that vision is for the continent, because it isn't interactive, and it's always going to be an interactive. And then the third thing is Africa has to be unified for transformation to take place, and that is the Pan-Africanism, which has been the leading spirit of political mobilization across this continent from the very beginning. When many of the nationalist leaders were mobilizing their population, they were doing it with the aspirations and the example of others, whether it was Kenyatta or Nyerere, you can go on, but not just on the African continent, but also looking at the Caribbean, looking at the civil rights movements in America, looking at liberation movements globally. So taking the inspiration from everywhere, but doing it in a way that's both self-determining and from a self-aware point of view of where do you want to be.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fraser. And I think that's an excellent, setting the stage for the conversation, because a lot of the things that you're speaking about are, some of the themes that we'll have in this conversation. And I think the idea of identity is something that's really coming out strongly as a recurring theme. If we do not know who we are, then, we don't know where we're going and where we want to position ourselves. And it's also very important to look at Africa not in isolation, but also, contextualize our transformation at the global stage and see how we can, take advantage of global trends and uniquely position Africa. So I think Dr. Fraser mentioned that Rwanda and the RPF stand out as, cases on the continent that, that have truly embodied transformation. And I want us to take a closer look at the case of Rwanda. And I'll come to you, Dr. Shaka. As the CEO of the RGB, you oversee an institution that translates the political ideology of Rwanda into the governance and institutional frameworks that are required. And one thing that Rwanda has really been recognized for internationally is being able to develop our homegrown innovative solutions that respond to the unique context of our needs, but at the same time being able to learn from and adopt global best practices. So I want you to speak a little bit more about that approach and why it's important, and how is Rwanda able to practically achieve that balance?
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you, the leadership of RPF and the cadres. Let me start first by wishing all the cadres to enjoy the 30th anniversary by starting with a deep reflection on the 30 years, but also the young people who are here thinking ahead, reflecting on what we need really to do to consolidate the achievements. I will build on what His Excellency Mkapa has put forward regarding RPF and CCM as political parties that shown both self-confidence, self-reliance, self-determination, and self-development, which to some extent complements with Mwenda's point on Agachiro when it comes to the RPF. So when you look at it closely, as Louise, you're asking, you find that post-genocide Rwanda has been very good at two things: at innovating based on its own internal capital, but also at learning from the best, not copying from them, but learning best practices and trying to contextualize them, because the context matters. And I would say that the RPF and its leadership has been very successful in instilling in post-genocide Rwanda a political culture that combines both those elements of self-reliance, self-confidence, but also the openness of Rwanda to the region, to Africa, and to the world. And that the combination of the two has created an opportunity for this country to develop further. And one might ask, where does it come from? So I think the mother of that political culture is the liberation struggle. The liberation struggle that started to be prepared in 1987 at the birth of the RPF, but more importantly, starting with 1990 to 1994, you will recall, in different parts of the continent where you had liberation movements that entered into a military struggle, they usually used to tap into opportunities of huge resources coming from outside, military equipments, but the RPF started from within without its own means. The liberation struggle was an enterprise by Rwandans, young Rwandans in the RPF. And that really constitutes the motherhood of the self-reliance trend that we see in Rwanda today. The second point I wanted to make is when you look again, scan a bit the continent from the south to the west, east, and you see a set of vulnerabilities across those countries. And when you look at it deeply, and probably that's what the RPF has managed to do, you see three critical imperatives that in the context of Rwanda, RPF has handled close to perfection. The imperative number one is the imperative of values-based politics and leadership. That's where the notion of patriotism comes in, the notions of unity, accountability, the fight of corruption that Mwenda was referring to, the notions of values, human values that can drive each and every society, the notions, the values of sacrifice, the values of resilience. Those values have been capitalized by the RPF leadership and have become the values that Rwandans have embraced. And that has constituted a huge capital for national transformation. The second imperative is the imperative of peace, security, and healing. In the context of Rwanda, we've seen Gacaca coming in a context where the post-genocide challenges were impossible to handle by conventional means. But Gacaca came, we know the success of Gacaca, we know the Abunzi, we know the community policing, we see the Army Week, what it's doing, we see the Ndumunyarwanda, it's also about peace and security, the living together. So RPF leadership in just these 30 years is a big time, but it's also a short time for a lifespan of a nation. When you look at how Rwanda has handled those imperatives related to peace and security, the imperative of building a security architecture that is people-centered, you understand that this movement has been really doing a good job to this nation. The third and last imperative I would talk about is the imperative of inclusive governance and people-centeredness. So inclusive governance, His Excellency Mkapa referred to inclusion of women and the youth, but when you look at Rwanda, the inclusion is much broader because the imperative of inclusiveness has actually shaped Rwanda's democratic governance system. From right away the genocide till the end of the transition, and even now, power sharing is a fundamental principle of our constitution. Different political parties are being built in a spirit of political parties being partners, not enemies, and we see across the continent, and actually have seen it in Rwanda. Political parties used to be virulent enemies one to another. So that spirit and that drive of building a democratic governance that is based on inclusiveness, that brings on the board women, people from different political parties, is absolutely very instructive. The consensual model of democracy, because politics is everything. Politics in the life of a nation is what a foundation is for a house. If the house needs to be strong, the political governance needs to be well made. So I think consensual democracy and power sharing, but also more importantly, the citizen-centeredness means, if you look at the homegrown solutions you are referring to, they are meant to drive all those three elements about welfare of the people. If you go to Girinka, you go to Budehe and many others, it's about building the inclusion. The whole democratic system of Rwanda that's how it is made. It's about ensuring security and stability of the nation. So and in conclusion, I would say that as the say goes, where there is a will, there is always a way. And in the RPF, there wasn't only a will, there was a collective will. And when you have a collective will, definitely the way is absolutely successful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shaka. And from what I'm hearing, you say is that a lot of our governance ideals and the institutions that were built around those is inspired by the values that we hold. And one value that has come up repeatedly and seems to be taking center stage, which I would like us to explore a little bit more, is the ideal of self-reliance. And I think this is one of the key themes that we have during this international conference. And I want to put this to you, Diko. And I think, as His Excellency Mkapa said very eloquently, we're starting to see a lot more African leaders calling for Africa to lead its transformation on its own terms of engagement. We want to be able to build up a self-reliant Africa, a unified Africa that can engage with the rest of the world on a level playing field. And there's been progress, but as His Excellency said, we're still seeing that there's a lot of dependencies. A lot of our economies are dictated by foreign interests. We're still having very low levels of intra-African trade, which shows that perhaps African states are not that keen to do business with each other. And we still have a very low bargaining power when it comes, to the global stage, especially in terms of trade and investment. And I think His Excellency, very bluntly, more bluntly than perhaps I would, spoke to some of the reasons why, Africa is facing challenges in pursuing this ideal of self-reliance. Now, what I want to ask is, how do you think we can overcome those challenges, and maybe also to look at a more nuanced approach, which I think also Dr. Fraser looked at, is are African states able to build up this concept of a unified Africa while at the same time being able to advance their own national interests, which given the complexity of our continent can be quite different and quite diverse?
Thank you very much. Let me first start by saying that how honored I am to be here, not only as a Munyarwanda, but also as a member of the RPF. As some of you know, I was here during the presidential campaigns, and it was an exercise which I enjoyed because I believe that the RPF presidential candidate was the right choice, not only for Rwanda, but for Africa. Thank you. I will not dwell on what the RPF did or has done to address the challenge of self-reliance in Rwanda, because that has been adequately and eloquently spoken to by His Excellency President Kappa, by Dr. Shaka, and of course by Andrew. I will just highlight some of the challenges other African countries are still facing quickly and put it in a way in a less intellectual way than His Excellency President Kappa did, so that perhaps the youths will understand some of the challenges out there for countries on the continent. First of all, in some of these countries, the leaders have a mindset of a new colonial agent. The leaders and the elite that replaced the colonial masters, they became agents of the former colonial masters and inherited their colonial mentality and racist thoughts first. Secondly, colonial rule had a very devastating effect on some African countries, crushing their spirit, destroying their self-confidence, dignity, and pride. With the result that leaders and the elite of these countries could be considered spineless. And please, I know it's not politically correct, but I'll cite as an example Congo DRC. We all know what Leopold did to Congo. And I say this because I was faced with a situation where I had to ask my Congolese counterparts why they thought it was normal to take advice from Europe, where the regional integration was progressing, and where you had a situation of centuries of war between France, the UK, and Germany, and where they spoke different languages, had different histories, and yet they were not exploiting the opportunities for closer relationship with Rwandans who shared the same culture, who shared perhaps the same pre-colonial heritage. And that led me to the conclusion that their spirit had been crushed. Thirdly, at independence, the colonial authorities in some countries imposed political, economic, military structures and arrangements to guarantee continued dependence on the colonial masters. Some of the structures, it's like the CFA franc monetary zone that comes to mind. Fourthly, the colonial policy of divide and rule on the basis of regional and ethnic divisions, which weaken the state, have been kept and continued as a practice because it's politically expedient in some countries. That's the reality. Fifthly, you have a question of the mentality of heavy dependence. You have resource-rich countries which still depend heavily on external assistance, look up to external assistance for their development. This is a problem. And I would say, lastly, the reliance or heavy reliance on productive structures or production structures inherited from the colonial masters or the colonial era, it's a binding constraint. Now quickly, some thoughts of how this could be addressed. I think those have already been articulated by Dr. Shiaka and by President Kappa, and I think that the example of the RPF, of President Kagame and the RPF, is the way to go. First of all, there is a need for the leader to change the mindset because it's all in the mind. The leaders have to understand that the countries cannot fully develop unless their countries are self-reliant. The leaders need vision. They need to lead the development of a culture of self-reliance, and this is where the RPF did an excellent job. There also need to be political education. Here, President Kagame's visionary leadership has been very important, and the RPF has played a great role in political education, focusing on building a spirit of unity, hard work, dignity, discipline, and self-reliance. When President Obama started his campaign, he had as a mantra, "Yes, we can." When you look at the post-genocide of the Tutsi history of Rwanda, you can't help feeling that the RPF has always, led by President Kagame, has always had that spirit of yes, we can. Nothing is impossible. So that has to be built, the confidence has to be built, discipline has to be built, and then the leader and the government have to develop a strategy for reducing external assistance so that aid or external assistance should complement, supplement, and come up to fill up the government's development efforts. And in this regard, I'll come back to something which I learned in Rwanda, and I learned from President Kagame, the difference between good aid and bad aid. Good aid is aid which is aligned to the country's priorities. Good aid is aid which is aligned to the country's strategy to reduce aid dependency. So the countries have to be committed to accepting only good aid. The countries have to be committed to reducing dependency because they will only be free once they only have true economic liberation once they can achieve that. Now, I do not think, just coming back to the final point, the last point you raised, I do not think there's a contradiction between national interests and collective interests, national self-reliance and collective self-reliance. I just want to mention that in passing that in 1980, when the Lagos Plan of Action was designed, The African leaders recognized this because what they said was that they'll commit themselves to the pursuance of collective self-reliance and to the support of existing regional groupings and the initiation of new regional groupings. So I don't think there's a contradiction, and President Nkapa eloquently explained that there shouldn't be a contradiction. I don't think it's necessary for me to go into that because he's already explained it, and he explains why the narrow, myopic, selfish interests of leaders is preventing Africa from coming together to develop a voice, stand as one, to be strong in the face of something which I remind him he said somewhere else, in the face of the coming second scramble for Africa. So I think that is the way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diko. And as you said, having that can-do attitude, extremely important. And I think Andrew Mwenda also said that, in Rwanda, we've been very fortunate, especially, I don't know if I should say us, the young people, that we've inherited this, and it's, because it seems to be the norm, it's second nature to us. And President Kagame also said this, that, transformation is something that comes by just doing it. And so, you don't have to wait until all the cards are lined up before you go ahead. You just simply need to do it, and you will learn by doing that. Now, coming from that, Africa-wide perspective, I want us to come back and look at the Rwanda perspective, and in particular, the role of the RPF-Inkotanyi in driving Rwanda's socioeconomic transformation. And I think Andrew Mwenda obviously did an excellent job in setting the scene, and perhaps leaves very little for us to say on this, but I want to turn to you, Dr. Kimonyo. You have a book that has just recently come out, Rwanda Dome, and in that book you mention how from the very outset, one of the key objectives of the RPF was to fundamentally transform Rwanda and make sure no one was left behind, and that this pioneering aspiration has actually remained the hallmark of the RPF over the last 30 years, which is really, no mean feat in itself. And as everyone said, I think that really deserves, a lot of recognition to the RPF and its leadership. Now, as we celebrate these 30 years and, take the opportunity to look back, reflect on what's been achieved, and see how we can chart new paths forward, and what are some of the key themes, especially in your book, that help us to understand how the RPF was able to preserve its objectives for which it was founded, while at the same time doing something which is completely different from fighting a liberation struggle, and that is coming up, with an effective state and delivering national transformation.
Thank you, Louise. I would like to wish the RPF a happy 40th anniversary. Some of us who grew up with it, in the beginning, we never thought, even our wildest dreams, that it will achieve what I've achieved. So I'm very proud here to be, and to have been there also at the beginning. Regarding your question about the key factor that made RPF able to transition from the post-war situation to the new Rwanda, I would highlight three factors. The first one is a consistent ideological clarity, stubbornly defending the general interest. Said that, it seems easy. And the way I say it is a bit flat, but I think that to understand better the strength and depth of this factor, you have to link this factor to the conclusion of Mwenda when he talked about identity and the passion about this goal of defending the general interest. But the general interest being the interest of Rwanda and Abanyarwanda. This said, this factor also met a number of challenges. When I talk about consistent and clarity, of course, there have been challenges on those two elements. The first one was with our political partners in the government of national unity, because some of our partners have been grew up in another political dispensation, the previous regimes, and they didn't have the same view of what the nation should be and what should be the relation between the citizen and the state and different things like that. And even more precisely, some of them were completely sectarian, we know that. Others who thought that political patronage was something that was normal. So that was the first challenge that, for this consistent ideological clarity. The second challenge came from our own ranks. Some of our comrades, and some of them quite illustrious comrades, starting to develop a sense of entitlement and develop also unethical public behaviors. And this happened in the end of the 90s, and it caused a crisis in the movement. But the crisis has been surmounted by political clarification, where clearly the path has been redefined, and the country was able to go to advance again. And the third challenge that I would like maybe to highlight here is maybe even more difficult. It's a permanent one. Is the challenge posed by the international community. When I talk about a consistent ideological clarity, means that under this clarity, RPF, but also its partners in the government and the population also choose a certain number of policies and even a certain number of political orientation. And among those political orientation, there is the issue of consensual democracy and power sharing. But this path is completely at odds with what the international community has been advocating very forcefully since the 90s. For the international community, competitive politics, which in Africa often becomes confrontational politics, have become an end in itself, while RPF is advocating something that is contrary to that. It is consensual democracy and power sharing. And many of the tension that we know or difficulties that we have come from this very different ideological orientation. The second factor, to be very quick, is the sharing of the vision with our political partners, but also with the population. End of 90s, when the country was not advancing the way it should be advancing, RPF started to think about how to resolve the situation. And RPF decided to discuss the issue of the political orientation with its partners, political partners, but not only political partners, but also social forces, NGOs, religious leaders, and other social forces. And RPF went about it in a very deliberate manner, because they knew exactly what they were looking for. They were looking for attaining a shared vision of Rwanda. And for that, they took the means to arrive to these results. They organized what we called the Urugwiro discussions that lasted 9 months, where every Saturday, the whole leadership of the country was gathering and discussing from 9 to sometimes midnight about different issues the country was facing. And this effort in sharing this vision, I think, also was an important factor. Just not only sharing, but also accepting or receiving also inputs of those partners, because a big part of RPF came from outside, and those who were here also had a very input to give to this political vision that we want to push forward. The first factor, this one will be very quick, is a visionary, forward-looking, and capable leadership. I think you understand who I mean. Now, there's a number of challenges about the continuity of, let's say, those factors, especially about the continuity of this consistent ideological clarity. The conditions that made the RPF be formed are very different than the conditions that we have today. Meaning that part of this ideological orientation also came from those conditions that existed at that time. And because the conditions have changed so far, so dramatically, and it's a very good thing because that was the first aim of RPF. But still, maybe that success itself is creating a new challenge. We are entering, we have already entered in a very different Rwanda. And even yesterday I was challenging you for the new generation because the conditions are so difficult. Where are you going to find this consistent ideological clarity?
Yeah, and I actually want us to come back to that a bit later, but thank you for that, Dr. Kimonyo. And coming back to some of the ideas that we've had all morning, which is the importance of clarity, understanding what it is you want to achieve, having a vision, ensuring that there's consensus, and also political inclusiveness, in the amount of participation in taking political decisions. Now, we cannot have a conversation on Africa's transformation without talking about the role of the private sector, and I want to bring this to you, Mr. Mwangi. I think today most African states are aligned on the premise that the private sector is really going to fuel our transformation, and that we must place the private sector at the center of any aspirations we have for transformation if we're going to achieve rapid and equitable growth. And the question that I want to ask is, do you feel that Africa's private sector is ready to take up this challenge? Has it taken its place and is able to, to tackle the economic and social challenges of our times? And what do you think will be the defining role of the private sector in that? And perhaps you could also speak a little bit to the kind of partnerships that we'll need to be seeing between the public and the private sectors in achieving this.
Fantastic. Thank you for the question, Louise. And it's always great to go after so many insightful comments. It's a real challenge to tackle a question that will probably take several years to fully answer in detail, but I'll offer a few views to begin with. And the first is to say sometimes we fall into a trap of saying private sector as if it was one big monolith. I can think of at least 3 different answers to your question, depending on whether I am talking about private sector in the sense that many at the top tables of policymaking think of it, which is big businesses, the multinationals, global investors, incumbent companies. Whether we're talking about business as we experience it in our day-to-day lives across Africa, where private sector really means every entrepreneur trying to make a living for themselves. And that extends from the smallholder farmer to the owner of the shop around the corner, to the cobbler, the plumber, everyone else that we rely upon every day. And then thirdly, private sector as those transformative entrepreneurial new ventures that are out there trying to grow from being small and early to actually reshape and restructure the economy in some way, shape, or form, to actually become the next Alibaba or the next Google, etc. Those businesses that are actually trying to disrupt and change. To answer the question, if I look at Africa today, I think too much of our attention or our thinking around the private sector is focused on the large incumbents. Almost by definition, if you're a large, successful company in Africa for a long time and are still successful today, you have been a part of the economic structure that has gotten Africa to this point. In a sense, looking to you to learn a new trick is probably not where we need to go, right? And what is the challenge there? What you see is a real focus on Africa as a place where resources are extracted, where there's a small set of middle-class consumers who meet the external picture of what a good market looks like. And that's who we will target. Even with local enterprises, we'll say, well, there's a small middle class, that's who we'll tailor our services to. Everyone else cannot afford to engage. Where there is a sense that what we're trying to do is implement global best practices to local realities. We're not trying to understand where we are and what we can do there. We're trying to copy something from elsewhere. And we look with surprise and shock when it doesn't work. And most importantly, it's a culture of chasing the deal rather than executing on the opportunity. right? So you're always looking for that specific concession, that specific transaction, as opposed to then saying, how do I actually build a platform that can over time, transform a particular aspect of the economy I'm in? And if we then step back and say, what does the future mean? Well, we already know that the small traders, the small entrepreneurs are trying to do what they can. And what we are lacking across Africa is that attitude of a transformative private sector, a disruptive private sector that looks at the big challenges of the continent and says, what are the opportunities within those challenges? Right? And I would put three forward as really where, if a business doesn't have an answer about how it's going to engage with these three issues, I believe it's heading for trouble in Africa and indeed anywhere in the world. The first is, and these are linked to three major challenges that I think are universal. The first is a universal challenge around inequality. And it translates to the real question. Africa has the youngest population in the world. Those young people are looking for things to do, ways to generate a living. How will we integrate them into the economy? What do they need? How will we serve them? If you are not clear on your role as a business in that question, well, guess what? If we fail to address that issue, it's the biggest risk, one of the biggest risks facing your organization or your business. The second challenge, the challenge of social cohesion, which usually comes as a result of the challenges of inequality. How is it that we are actually creating predictable, realms in which the private sector can thrive? How are businesses themselves contributing to including people regardless of age, race, gender, political positioning, religion? If we can't do that, then those divisions immediately translate into barriers against growth. And if you don't believe me, look at how the lack of cohesion, some of the challenges that we've seen in some of our African countries have limited them from taking advantage of either their resource wealth or particular economic opportunities that have come their way. And the third challenge is that of ecological sustainability, the real impact that climate change is having on all our lives. I look at people today saying, well, climate change is not an African issue, really. And then I say, in the very next sentence, you'll talk about how rains have become unreliable, and we're not necessarily able to grow the same crops that we were before, and how we're seeing various kinds of natural disasters striking us and damaging our infrastructure. Those two things have to be brought together. So if you're thinking about those three challenges, and you're thinking as a businessman today, or a businesswoman and an entrepreneur in Africa, I think you then need to apply a new set of lenses, a new set of disciplines. The first is really anchoring in where you are and who you are, right? Understand your market, understand the people around you, both as the employees of the future, that workforce of the future, as well as your consumers. And very few, too few, African enterprises, in my view, have really anchored in a deep insight into what the African is looking to do and accomplish in their lives. So build from that deep consumer insight. Secondly, embrace technology and embrace innovation. We cannot try to solve 19th century problems with 20th century technology in the 21st century. I think the most telling, one version of this that really stuck with me, President Kagame himself said this at the World Economic Forum in a conversation I had a good fortune to attend, which is, we cannot ignore the fact that the fourth industrial revolution is changing everything about our modern world. Africa already missed the first, arguably missed or came late to the first, second, and third industrial revolutions. Firstly, we cannot afford to miss the fourth. And secondly, unlike many other parts of the world, we have less to lose. If people aren't already working in old school industrial factories, we don't have to worry about that. Let's embrace the disruption. Let's embrace the new technologies. Let's immediately leap to the front instead of believing that we can excuse ourselves from the language of progress. And the only way that happens is through innovators and entrepreneurs in the private sector. Then, related to that, and coming to the point of partnership, and I do recognize that we are short on time, is two things. The first is, to be a truly transformative entrepreneur, you need to think big. And unfortunately, across Africa, and I think Rwanda is a useful and telling exception, young people, entrepreneurs, innovators, are told repeatedly, no, you can't. Wait your turn. Wait to be promoted to MD. Wait to earn your space at the top table and learn how to do things properly. And by properly, it means whatever the colonial masters left 40 years ago as the manual for how you run a bank in East Africa. Not a real analysis of what are the needs in terms of financial inclusion in a modern rural market or a modern urban market. So how do you change that? How do you get someone to not only think big, but not only think disruptively, but think big? Particularly when our countries are so small. That's where the regional integration question comes in. How do we challenge our entrepreneurs to look beyond their borders and say, if I can serve the needs of a smallholder farmer in Rwanda, actually I can meet those same needs in Uganda. Actually, I should be planning in 3 years' time to be entering Tanzania. And thereafter, how do I go after the Kenyan smallholder market? Instead, we tell them, wait your turn. Did Jack Ma wait his turn? Did Mark Zuckerberg wait his turn? We need to get out of our way and think big and lower the barriers to thinking big. I always tell the story of the fact that as an entrepreneur, as an African entrepreneur running a business, I have always found it a lot easier to bring in Western colleagues. They find it a lot easier to get visas to most African countries than I, who is employing them. The argument being, the Westerners are bringing knowledge and skills that we need. What are you bringing? And I would congratulate Rwanda for being one of the leaders in lowering the barriers to talent, African talent moving around. Because the reality is, people talk about Africa's blessing as its resources underground. That is our curse. Our actual resource is the young people walking around in the streets. The things we have between our ears, not the things beneath our feet, is where our wealth and our prosperity will come from. And I'll conclude by talking finally about that demand for partnership. Because the reality is no business can succeed in the African context with so many needs unaddressed unless it's coordinating its efforts with government, with civil society, with the community at large. Because you will depend on getting a lot of things right in order for your business to thrive. You cannot afford to be like a CEO in a developed country saying, you know what, the only thing I care about is my bottom line. Because that is brittle growth. How do you create inclusive growth, and how are you a participant in addressing the needs for education, healthcare, social services? Because if you do that, you're creating a loop of shared prosperity that will come right back to helping grow your business. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
Thank you, James. It's a very salient point, and I think a very strong call to our private sector and our young entrepreneurs, particularly, to be disruptive. Think big and look at the opportunities. I mean, the challenges that we might see as in Africa as actually business opportunities. And as you speak, I'm reminded of a concept that I think Bill Gates spoke of, which is creative capitalism, and it's really a challenge to the private sector to take on a twin mission of making money while improving lives, and I think that that's what she's speaking to. Now, as private sector, an important sector, and another equally important sector in Africa specifically is agriculture, and I want to come back to you, Dr. Fraser. I think, African governments really are starting to view agriculture through a transformative lens, with the understanding that it is a sector with the right information that has immense potential to significantly reduce poverty, but also to drive sustainable and the inclusive growth that we've been speaking of. Now, the East African Commodities Exchange, which you were very instrumental in setting up and continue to manage, has set out to transform this sector by empowering smallholder farmers and also connecting them to global markets. So I want you to speak to your experience in establishing and running the East Africa Commodities Exchange in the region, and from an opportunities and challenges perspective. And also more broadly, how do you think African governments should position agriculture to be the catalyst of growth that it can be, and make sure that it has strong linkages to other sectors of the economy?
Thank you very much. First, I think it's important to talk a little bit about what a commodity exchange is. It's not exactly obvious. Basically, a commodity exchange is a market between buyers and sellers, which is trying to make that market a lot more transparent and fair. Specifically with East Africa Exchange, what we have three pillars of the exchange. One is secure storage, which is absolutely critical for issues of food security and ending post-harvest loss and food safety. Then we also look at, we have a platform, electronic trading platform, NASDAQ, which helps to bring about greater price transparency in the market and price discovery so that buyers and sellers are a little bit more on equal footing in terms of what the cost of produce is, because we're an agricultural commodity exchange. And then third is agricultural financing. Particularly what we do is because of our secure storage, we're able to guarantee the product. And that helps banks to be able to provide financing to farmers because they have a collateralized product in our warehouses that allows them then to give financing. And so when you really think about it, the commodity exchange really is very much a partnership with the government of Rwanda and private sector. And it's focused on helping smallholder farmers particularly. And what is the challenge that the smallholder farmer has? And it's a challenge here in Rwanda, but it's across Africa. Part of it is that they typically harvest at the same time. And if you harvest at the same time, that means you're supplying the market at the same time, and it's a flood of product and the prices drop. And so you're really at the point when you're harvesting, you're getting the least economic value for your labor over the whole season. And so what we try to do is give them the opportunity to store their product in the warehouses so that they don't all have to sell at the same time. And then that can extend the market and give them higher prices, because at some point, after all the product's gone, prices go up. And the smallholder farmer isn't able to realize that price increase. The trader is, because the trader takes their product, holds it, the smallholder farmers already sold everything, and when prices go up, it's too bad for them. And so the value of their labor is going to somebody else other than them. By doing our warehouses, we allow them to store and then enter the market at the time that's best for them and their family, and for getting the greatest value. The second thing that we do in our storage is we grade the product and we clean it. We help them to have a standardized product. And this is both valuable for the farmer because it's value addition, so that they can get a higher price for, say, grade A maize versus grade C or D maize. So that helps them in terms of the value addition, but it also helps the trader. So when you're trying to act as a market between the buyer and the seller, or the processor for that matter, because it's standardized, they know exactly what they're getting. They pay the price for what they're getting. And we guarantee that standardization. And so that's against us. So we stand in between the market as a guarantor of high quality product or whatever they're particularly buying. And again, as I said, the banks then also are very happy because they can finance the farmer. So that's essentially what the commodity exchange does, and that's the three pillars of it. I think that we've been, the challenges for us on the commodity exchange is, of course, the challenge that we've heard already, which is economy of size. It's fragmentation of the market. You're dealing with many small holders, and so trying to help them to do the aggregation is, we found that we entered it as a business, and we found we needed to become a transformative player for the sector as a whole. We couldn't just deal with being that market in between. We actually had to help be more of a transformative agent. And so some of the challenges were, the aggregation challenge, but we've been very successful in reaching out to farmers across Rwanda. We work with about 3,000 to 5,000 farmers, of which more than half are women farmers who are using our warehouses. The government has been a strong partner of ours. All of our warehouses are actually owned by the government. So they've been an extremely important partner. We also have a commodity exchange in Nigeria, which some of them are owned by the government, but many of them we lease. I think that the challenge, so the aggregation challenge is a problem. The infrastructure challenge has been difficult. But the biggest challenge is, as I said, the economy of scale, which is when East Africa Exchange is not called the Rwanda Agricultural Commodity Exchange. It's called the East Africa Exchange because our vision is to actually be regional, because we understand that you need bigger economies of scale for profitability, you need bigger economies of scale to transform the capital markets, because this is a capital market instrument as much as it is an agricultural instrument or institution. When we started, we actually tried to start in Kenya because we felt that, one, their banking system was more developed, and secondly, we figured their market is bigger, particularly because we wanted to work with smallholder farmers. We started with staples, with maize, and Kenya produces a whole bunch of maize, but they consume it all. But they produce a lot. And so we thought we'd start in Kenya, and we found many, many, many barriers, I would say, to actually starting. So President Kagame said, well, why don't you start here in Rwanda? And then we can move to Kenya and to Uganda, to Tanzania, to Burundi. At that time, Burundi wasn't in the war that it is at this time. We're talking about 2011, 2010, 2011. And we then came to the Northern Regional Integration Quarter and said, well, we want to be a regional exchange. We need to have bigger size of economies for this to work. East Africa is further along in terms of regional integration. So East Africa is the place where we're going to do this. And we're going to do, Nigeria is a big market, bigger than all of East Africa. So the commodity exchange in Nigeria is fine, but in East Africa, it has to be regional. The Northern Regional Integration Corridor presidents agreed. They had the vision, and they said, they blessed it and said, start regionally. But then what we found is that at the bureaucratic level, there were many barriers, and nationalism, the question that you asked earlier, started to emerge its head in a very bad way. And everybody wanted their own, right? Everyone wants their own commodity exchange, but quite frankly, none of the countries in East Africa can sustain a single commodity exchange because you need the economy of scale. So we've had to manage that issue, right? When we go to Kenya and we meet with some of the more visionary ministers who understand it needs to be regional, they say, yes, regional, but Kenya regional. And then you go to Uganda and they say, well, no, actually, we want our own, and we're going to put barriers in the way so that you can't actually do the trading here, even though the market is already regional. So that's been a challenge, and we'll work through it. Tanzania has put up, traditionally it's put up barriers to trading maize. I think they have a barrier right now to trading maize into Kenya. Those are the challenges. Even some people said, even Rwanda at one point, the Capital Markets Authority said, you can only use warehouses that we have certified. But then we explained, but if you say that, then how do we use warehouses across the region? Right? Because the Rwanda Capital Market Authority isn't certifying warehouses in Kenya. So because they had the vision, they said, you're right, and stepped back. And so we worked very collaboratively with the Capital Markets Authority here because commodity exchanges aren't an institution that are well known. And so you're actually having to work with all of the ministries, trade, finance, agriculture, to build the regulations, and the Capital Markets Authority to implement. And so I've learned quite a lot. As I said, we're doing quite well. We've traded over 12,000 metric tons in Rwanda this past year. That's over $4 million in trade turnover. We have at least 6 or 7 banks participating, providing financing. And so it's a slow process, but we're building. And I think it's clearly the necessary institution to transform agriculture. It's very frustrating to me that you'll see certain donors come in and they're picking little pieces of the problem and not dealing with the whole value chain. And in fact, some of the pieces of the problem is creating the challenge and keeping the market fragmented. And so it's not only the nationalism, but it's also that lack of a sectorial perspective on what's needed to be transformative.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fraser. And I just want to pick up on the challenges that you're facing as a business that is trying to do business regionally. And I think, you very rightly said that, regional integration has to be an imperative for transformation precisely because of the scale challenge that Africa has. Most of our domestic markets in the 54 African countries is simply too small to attract, any significant investments of scale. And I want to bring this back to you, Diko. I know that, His Excellency Mkapa mentioned, spoke quite extensively on the issues that we have with regional integration. And I think from what Dr. Fraser is saying, you can see the actual impact, that this has on businesses. And I want you to touch on, so how do we overcome this challenge? We are seeing an apparent political will. There's strong calls for integration. We have a proliferation of regional institutions and agreements, but that is not, translating into action on the ground. So how do we overcome that and be able to respond to the challenges that businesses like the East African Commodity Exchange are facing?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think one of the first steps, there is hope. President Kagame will be heading the AU when he becomes the chairperson of the AU. The reason I say this is because the founders of the OAU and the AU were relying on these institutions to sort of take charge on promotion of regional cooperation and drive regional integration by setting up a framework for implementing the different protocols and agreements. And that hasn't been happening. But there's hope that going forward that will happen, because that will be necessary. The protocols and the protocols and the agreements do exist. Now we have to execute, we have to implement, and we have to make sure we do what we promised, whether it's in terms of rationalization of the various regional communities, whether it's in terms of taking steps which would allow us to move towards the establishment of an African economic community, which is very, very important. And it comes back to the point which President Mkapa made in a different forum, where he alerted African leaders of the upcoming second scramble for Africa. And he compared it to the first scramble for Africa, and that there is a design to keep Africa as a producer of very low-level products, either as primary exporters or low-level products, and keep them down the value chain. And that the global competitive environment is becoming so complex that unless Africa get together to have one voice and be united and speak as one, then they're going to find themselves, they're going to be lost. And I think that's a very important point. But beyond that, there are things which can be done at the level of the regional markets. First of all, efforts have to be made to build regional infrastructure and regional linkages. These are quick wins. Rwanda has been doing its part, building roads to the frontier, carrying out reforms to reduce non-tariff barriers, and indeed in other regions, the Rwandan example is being copied. But for ego reasons, for jealousy, for political rivalry, some leaders tend to turn their back and refuse to do their part. For example, Rwanda builds a road to one of the neighboring countries, which is supposed to provide a corridor, on the expectation that the neighboring country will build a road to the border. That is not done. I won't cite the countries who are culprits in this case, to be politically correct. Rwanda builds transmission lines to the border, expecting the neighboring country to build a connecting line. That is not done. And yet that is so important, because there is surplus energy, and there is surplus energy expected to come, for example, from the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Now, if certain neighboring countries do not build transmission lines to the Rwandan border and substations, Rwanda is ready. Rwanda is not going to have access to cheap, not immediately, to low-cost energy and supply, an adequate supply to drive its ambition to become a light manufacturing center, to drive the ambition of all the industries envisaged for the special economic zone. So these are challenges. You have the problem of political will, which President Kappa talked about. Really, conversations have to come around this. And here the AU has a very important role to play. You have the problem of circulation of people's services and goods. Here, President Kagame has been the champion. Every African can fly into Rwanda and get a visa at the border. But there are regions where governments, like the Central African region, where governments have, within CEMAC, where governments made the commitment, but it is not being implemented. These are some of the challenges. Yet, we all agree that to achieve the ambition of having private sector inclusive growth, you need large markets, you need economies of scale, as you were just explaining. You need to have the appropriate technology to make it economic, for us to be able to move up the value chain. You need large markets. You need these regions. Then apart from that, you need to enhance regional cooperation. I think those who read, and if you haven't done so, you should read, President Kagame's speech at Sharm el-Sheikh 2 days ago. He made this point, the importance of regional cooperation, the importance of us to move some steps forward. Go beyond the region, go beyond EAC. Look for a wider free trade, African free trade area. In the case of Sharm el-Sheikh, of course, as you all know, it was creating a free trade space which brings in COMESA, SADC, and the East African community. Now, there's also the need to recognize that not all the countries in a given regional community will move at the same pace. I mean, the EAC should not slow down its progress in deepening its regional integration because of the situation in Burundi. No, that should not happen. And for some of you who may not know, Rwanda has been a champion in regional integration because I give you an example. In, I think it was 2008, 2009, Rwanda paid the fee, the contribution of Burundi. Many people don't know that. And it did. This is the kind of cooperation we need. Cooperation between nations, cooperation between regions. And we're hoping that more of this will be done during the next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mukete. I want to turn quickly to you, James, for your concluding thoughts. I think from the conversations that we've had today and also some of the global conversations that are happening, there is a strong optimism that Africa is on the brink of a major, transformation, and this is really ours to lose. And I think this is coming from, what people are seeing. We've had sustained high growth, we have a large growing consumer base, and the huge potential for a demographic dividend. And so there hasn't been any doubt that we have experienced a lot of growth. But the questions are now turning to the quality of that growth, and particularly as it relates to inclusiveness. We still have very high income inequality rates, the ability to create jobs. One of the biggest challenges the youth have is high unemployment, and also value addition. And there's also some concerns around whether this transformation or the growth that we're seeing will actually last. And I think we saw that several African economies had a downturn in 2016. And so the question that I want to put to you is, how do you see African economies being able to really seize this window of opportunity that we have, make sure that our economies are resilient and globally competitive, and that this time we actually attain structural transformation. So James, I just want to know if you are truly optimistic that this time Africa is going to launch and take off.
So I think we have some work to do. I think that it was trendy even as little as a year ago to say we had gone from the dark continent to Africa rising. And then guess what? We started turning off the lights in a few places. In the sense that I think the very point you made about the brittle nature and the non-inclusive nature of the growth over the last few years, its dependence in many cases on a commodity boom that we did not create and did not really seek to really understand and think through, meant that we were in a way seeing something real, which is the massive potential of Africa, but not necessarily doing the things that we needed to do to fully realize it, and letting the statistics cheat us, in a sense. GDP is growing, economies are rising. And you saw behavior, and I'll describe some concrete examples. You saw behavior such as in the banking industry of our largest economy, in Nigeria, where we'd have discussions with bank executives saying, you know, how are you thinking about lending to small businesses? How are you thinking about engaging in the agriculture sector? And I would say, that's too risky, you know? Oil is where it's at. The natural result of that over-focus on a commodity, that ignorance of the mass market, of the needs of the average Nigerian in that instance, although the same story can be told about how the average South African has been ignored, or the average Kenyan, or the average Rwandan, that led to the reality that when the commodity prices went south and the tide went out, we could see who wasn't wearing anything under the waterline, right? So you've had this challenge around growth. The second thing you're starting to see, even in countries that were not commodity dependent, is where we haven't prioritized spreading the benefits of growth. You're starting to see social unrest. And that's entirely predictable. And the real message here is we are going to add, over the next decade and a half or so, something like 500 million young people into the workforce in a range of ways. If we do not have a plan for how we give each of them a stake in our economies, then we're in trouble. And the reality is we cannot do that for them. There's no employer in the world who will come in and absorb hundreds of millions of people. They are going to have to do it for themselves. Let me not say they. We are going to have to do it for ourselves. Because the reality is we're going to need to unlock local entrepreneurship, local innovation. And so when we get into conversations like around regional integration, for example, when we get into conversations like around the potential for agriculture, and we treat this as an academic exercise in a way, which some people tend to do, or there's a lack of urgency, perhaps in our institutions or in our governance structures, we ignore the fact that we are on a clock. And that clock doesn't give us 20 years, it gives us 10 to get this right. To realize our potential, Africa can feed the world. We are the last large pool of relatively unproductive and untapped fertile agricultural land in the world. And if we don't do it, no one else will. So the world will run out of food in 2030, or maybe a little bit later, if Africa does not undergo a rise in productivity, the likes of what we've seen in other parts of the world. What are we doing to accomplish that? Similarly, if we cannot unlock the power of our local entrepreneurs, get out of their way, follow the Rwandan example in terms of reducing the amount of time it takes to register a business. Follow the Rwandan example in terms of the ease with which you can hire talent from across Africa to come and work here alongside Rwandans, right? In one country, I'm having conversations with my African staff about their fears of xenophobia. I have conversations with my staff here, they're saying, well, it's so easy to engage with other parts of the continent. Why is it that the smallest country is leaning forward with transformational thinking, while the largest ones are stuck protecting what little they still have? We all have so little, we have to lean forward. And that means innovation in policy. It means a focus on aggressively transforming policy and opening up boundaries. And it means challenging the next generation to think big, because if they don't save themselves, there's no one else who will do it for them.
Thank you very much, Mwangi. And I think what you're saying is that it can be done, but we need to double our sense of agency. And I just want to quickly turn, we have a few minutes left, and so Dr. Kimonyo, if in just a couple of minutes, and this draws from a conversation that you had started earlier, and it's looking at the RPF in the context of moving forward. We've seen how the party has really been a leader, not only in Rwanda, but on the African and the global context in driving socioeconomic transformation. So how do we look at the RPF, other successful liberation movements, and export that experience to see the role of liberation movements, the lessons we can learn from these in this era that we're looking at of delivering national transformation? How do we export RPF's experience to benefit the rest of our continent?
Thank you, Louise. But RPF believes very much in ownership. Ownership of our own problem, ownership of your own solutions, meaning that exporting our model, people say, is not very RPF things to best of my knowledge, but still there is a thing that people can take from here and there. First thing, I think that if I refer a bit about the situation that my colleague just talked about the situation, the precarious situation in which Africa is now. A number of countries now are almost disintegrating. So, those in Mali, many in the Central African regions, and other countries also are not very well. And to me, I think that one of the reasons is because they don't own their own problem. And I'm going to come back again to this issue of confrontational politics. Confrontational politics is disintegrating a number of countries. So I think that maybe we are not going to export or promote our own model, but maybe we should urge other country, especially other country, to really own their own problem and look at the solutions that they need in their own situation, whatever the West will say or the international community. Another point I would like to say, if you look at this situation, liberation movements are a very good tool for transformation. I would say they are almost the only tool that exists in the African political landscape. First, they have been formed through a fight, and they needed people of power to do what they aim to do. So they are mass movements. They are most institutionalized than many other political parties that we know. And if you look at the Africa political spectrum, there's two kinds of parties. There's liberation movements, and there is liberal parties that came out in the 80s. But often those liberal parties are often elite-based party, and often they use as a tool for mobilization a certain level of populism, ethnicity, religion, and things like that. While liberation movements, because of their structure, they can mobilize people around rational goals. So I think that liberation movements are very important, but they have to be used correctly. And that's where the problem is. And I would say that one of the things that maybe we could ask them to look at as RPF is to see how, although we had the liberation movement, we had historical, we had people who fought, but very rapidly we made space for people who didn't fight directly with arms, for youth, for women. And if you want to transform your country, especially in this very fast-changing landscape that you have in Africa and the rest of the world, you need people that have other skills also. So you have to open.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kimonyo. And from what you're saying is that while we do definitely have lessons that we can share, it's always important that we're respectful of the contexts of other nations and take that into account. Now, I want us to wrap up this conversation with a final contribution from you, Dr. Shaka. And this is, looking at a conversation that we always have in Rwanda, which is building institutions that are going to outlast individuals. What are your thoughts on the kind of institutions and the leadership that we need in Africa that will be imperative in driving the kind of transformation that we've been talking about today? Thank you.
The bedrock of national transformation is definitely leadership. And the bedrock of Africa realizing full potential will lie in leadership as well. Probably the easiest way of describing the best, what a good leadership is, would be to just flash a few key features of describing our chairman, the President of the Republic and Chairman of RPF. So if you look at the Rwanda's journey and you look at the question you are putting forward, one would say that a good leader, the best leadership is a leadership that walks the talk, a leadership that cares about the people, a leadership that inspires the people, a leadership that is keen on political clarity, is keen on values, is keen on acting, not only talking, but also is very keen on translating people's aspirations into reality. So that kind of leadership will have the likelihood of succeeding. But also, as we are in a world that is globalizing, a good leadership is the one that is open to the region, open to the world. As His Excellency pointed it out rightly, quoting the President Paul Kagame, that Africa is our home. So therefore, a good leadership in our continent is a leadership that is oriented towards African solidarity, so towards Africa's full liberation. And I think going forward, that's really the biggest challenge ahead. We are talking about national transformation, but let's remember that Africa is our home. Let's remember that unless Africa is liberated, the realization of full liberation of Rwanda is going to be something halfway. So we need to get together to reach out to our brothers. We are happy to have brothers and sisters from neighboring countries and far, so that going forward we liberate Africa as our home. But of course, as they say, to realize that we need to consolidate our own national transformation. Coming to your last point about institutions, I think, in my opinion, institutions are not building. Systems come from the people. All depends on the type of cadreship. And the cadreship I'm talking about is not only skills, because you can have a very highly skilled public service, but at the end have no results when it comes to the efficiency and delivery. So the proper cadreship is a cadreship that has a character, a cadreship that is oriented towards collectiveness, collective cadreship that takes business and has commitment and moves together. And I think that's something that also we are learning from RPF, that element of being always playing as a collective, a movement that is driven from that collectiveness is of paramount importance in sustaining the transformation we have achieved, but also in ensuring that going forward we realize the full potential of Africa. In conclusion, His Excellency, while submitting the report for the AU reforms, put forward a very challenging sentence. He said, we have all we need to succeed as Africa. Failing Africa will be unforgivable. And I don't want the next generation to be unforgiven because of not taking that responsibility of really tapping into developing that cadreship with character, with discipline, and with the commitment to Africa and to our nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, panelists. I think I'll now open it up to the audience for comments or questions. We'll probably have time for maybe 3. And I hope we have protocol moving around the room with mics. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Remember to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and if there is a specific panelist that you would like to put your question to, please let us know. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Please go ahead. Can we please get his mic on? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Professor Tombola Gustave. I'm the Deputy Vice Chancellor in charge of Academics and Research of the University of Tourism, Technology and Business Studies, UTB, here in Kigali. I'm a Rwandan. I do appreciate the panelists on this sub-theme of driving the national transformation and realizing Africa's full potentials. When we look at, I'm contributing, I'm not having a question to the panelists.
Okay. Please do remember to keep your contribution brief and to the point.
Okay, fine. Okay. The contribution is the following. Africa has been going through transformation. 50 years of colonialism, 50 years after colonialism, and then there is a new era today. I do concur with Diko, who said that there should be a mindset from the leadership of Africa and all Africans as regards to especially education. When we look at education, when it was before, during colonial time, people were studying abroad. After colonialism, going abroad, and up to today, going abroad. We need to change really. How do we need to change? The transformation has to be strengthen the education in Africa and then make the leaders of Africa schooling their children in universities and schools of Africa. From there, we shall make this transformation as we are talking about.
Thank you very much. That's a very important point, and I hope you'll be around in the afternoon because we will be discussing that a bit more in the second panel. We had a question on this side of the room. If we could just, yes, thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Johnson Danyoye, and it is actually not a question, it is also a contribution. I just wanted to comment very briefly on the issues of institution development, leadership that drives such institutional development, and reform, especially African Union reform. I don't think I can add very much that is relevant to what His Excellency President Mkapa has said. Ukiona vyaelea vimeundwa. Nothing happens by accident. It's usually by design. I could also add on to that the fact that the taste of the pudding is in the eating. If we are here today as Rwandans able to talk, remembering our history, it's only because we had people, leaders, leadership, a leader that helped us get here and made it possible for us to be sitting in this beautiful place, discussing how we transform the country and debating on how we can actually transfer that across the region as a whole.
Okay, thank you very much. If we could have a question, preferably someone, one of our young people. Right, protocol, there's someone right down here in the middle. If we could have a mic to them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Noella Bigirimana. I work at the Rwanda Biomedical Center, which is an agency under the Ministry of Health. So from the panel today, it was very insightful, and I realized that I may be biased as an RPF member, but I realized that the RPF represents one of the best case studies in terms of transformation, self-reliance, and resilience. So I'm challenged as a young leader to think about the fact that we are addressing current challenges, looking at what has to be done, but also looking ahead because we have such a visionary leadership to 2, 3, 4, 5 generations ahead of us. So we are looking at fourth industrial revolution, leapfrog, and other different innovations. So my question to the panel, and hopefully I'm not taking too much time, but if we are to think about it as a framework for current leaders, for future leaders to follow, what is one factor from each of the panelists, one factor that you think could be part of that framework? So both thinking that nuance or thinking about current challenges, but looking at 2, 3, 4 generations ahead and keeping that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. I know we said only 3 questions, but we've only actually got 1 question. The rest were comments. All right, there's a question right here at the front. If we could have someone bring a microphone to the gentleman in the front. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a question on a comment that was made earlier, that such transformative ideology and capacity to mobilize people around it comes much easier to liberation movements, former liberation movements, because they do have that type of organization, that type of capacity to organize. Can we generalize from the exception that Rwanda has become? Because it is blessed actually with that kind of forthright thinking, longer term thinking, leadership. But when it works, yes, it is an important capacity for mobilization. But don't you think there has the risk also that these organizations, these liberation movements were created to fight actually against a certain kind of domination, and they create very efficient fighting machines, and that it is not very easy to transform those machines, in fact to get rid of them, if they don't work right. I just want you to see the experiences we have throughout the continent, and then try to say a balance sheet actually, on how have we fared. Are we lucky in Rwanda because we have such leadership?
Thank you very much. I think we also will take a comment from the Honorable SG, if no comment. Okay. Any other question? Maybe we can just take, I think we've had more comments than questions, but there was a particular question, and I think I'll put this to you, James, because you're the one that spoke about looking several generations ahead. And I think the young lady was asking, how do we do that? How do we, looking at where we are today, but you're looking, several years ahead, and positioning yourself with sort of that forward thinking.
So again, it's a fantastic question and a difficult one. I'll offer one answer, and it's not necessarily a comprehensive one, but I am increasingly excited about the power of thinking about platforms in general. And what do I mean by platforms? Platforms are innovations or investments that by their very nature make it easier for many other things to happen in the ecosystem around them. So when you invest or when you think about something, you can think about doing a specific vertical thing. I will go and work in this particular village and solve this particular issue for this particular group of people. Or you can say, what if I can lower the difficulty of getting things to every village at once in some way, shape, or form? What if I can ease the cost of communication? What if I can lower the cost of agricultural produce or improve the quality of storage across the board? And the reason why it's useful to think in terms of platforms is platforms have one thing in common, which is they are designed from the first moment to be used by others to do multiple things. And so when you're thinking multi-generationally, you're saying, I am standing on the shoulders of, and I am making use of platforms that were built for me. And those could be a governance structure that allows me to work in a particular way, or a set of laws and regulations that allow me to operate in a particular way. What am I investing in that will be a platform for the next generation to build upon? That will be largely universal, that will largely ease the process of getting something done. I'll give a very concrete example of one of the most interesting, I think exciting platform investments I'm seeing right now. In India, for a long time, there's been a struggle around the question of identity, actual identity, not personal identity, but identity papers and identification. And it took an entrepreneur from the private sector to partner with the government and say, what if we built a universal digital ID? And actually made sure that every single Indian has a biometrically based digital identification that is common and across the board. Now, on one level, this sounds like a relatively small thing. It only changes one thing. It means that instead of my paper ID, I now have my biometrics. But think about everything that depends on proving who you say you are, and you've done the things you say you've done, and you own the things that you say you own. That one investment, and it's only now coming to fruition in terms of getting all 1 billion or so Indians onto it, starts to shift the entire country from a 20th century economy to a 21st century economy, in that everything is accessible online to the most illiterate peasant, right? So it's a major investment. It's a one-time thing, but unlike many other ways that you could have used the same amount of money, it fundamentally changes how everything from banking to education to health records to taxation, all of it changes because of that one investment. So how do we bring that thinking around looking for opportunities to build new platforms that others may build upon, to every investment that we are making as a generation, thinking about the next generation to come?
Thank you very much. I am aware that we're running over time, and I don't think we'll be able to take any more comments and questions. So, Excellencies, distinguished guests, please join me in giving a very warm round of applause to our panelists. Thank you. Thank you. I think you've all shared very rich insights today, and I hope that, as I think was James that said, that this really inspires a renewed sense of urgency for everyone here to continue, forging the path ahead towards national transformation. And I think President Kagame said it very well. We keep on coming back to President Kagame, but he's such a visionary leader. And he said, transformation is easier said. It's a lot harder to implement, but it can be done if we all act collectively and start to challenge ourselves to think differently. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Wow, thank you very much to all panelists, but also the audience. We got very insightful comments. And again, I felt like I was back on university, and I've learned transformation can happen only when we are aware of who we are. But also we have to be confident enough to believe in our capacities in order to build some collective will. We will definitely need to change our minds. Yes, we can. And I think the younger generation that started RPF-Inkotanyi has proven that, yes, they could, and then today, yes, we can. And of course, we will have to be constant in whatever we start. I think His Excellency, former President of Tanzania, Mr. Mkapa, said it. We have to take time to get ready. And that means we have to be constant in whatever we are doing, whenever we start. And of course, from this panel, I've learned also we have to be disruptive in whatever solution we are proposing to our challenges. So, Diana, I think that's what I've learned. And now I will let you tell us maybe what you've learned or what's next.
Okay, I've learned just as much. I'm not going to go through all of them again, but indeed I thought it was a really interesting panel, and I hope the whole audience appreciated it, as well as our high-level guests. And now what we can suggest is to break for lunch and to come back in 1 hour because we're a little bit behind the schedule. So enjoy your lunch. Bon appétit.
So let us be back at 3:35. 3:35, we should start our second panel. Thank you a lot. Enjoy your meal.